Okay, Helena, we'll keep letting people out of the waiting room. If you want to get started with the interpretation, we can turn it over to you, and then I'll take over after that.
Okay, great. So, Marco, would you like to start with the Spanish interpretation instructions first before I go into the Zoom housekeeping rules?
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much. Buenos días a todos. Para aquellos que nos acompañan y desean escuchar el programa en español, por favor sepa que se ofrecen servicios de interpretación para la sesión. Para escuchar el programa en español, seleccione el icono del globo en la parte inferior de vuestra pantalla que dice Interpretation o interpretación. De ahí seleccione su idioma, Spanish, y podrá escuchar el programa enteramente en español. Please note, interpretation services are being offered for this morning session. To listen to any comments or questions given in Spanish, please select the globe icon at the bottom of your screen that says interpretation and select your language, English. And you will then be able to hear a live rendering of that comment from Spanish into English as well. Thank you so much, Elena. Back to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Marco. I'll add you back to the interpretation room after the Zoom housekeeping rules. So thank you everyone for joining. I want to just go over a few housekeeping rules before we get started with the presentation. First and foremost, please keep yourself muted during all presentations and when you're not speaking. If you would like to ask a question or make a comment, you can do so by raising your hand with the reactions button at the bottom of the screen, and we will call on you. If you don't see it at the bottom, you may have an older version of Zoom, and it may be an option next to your name in the participant list. If you're joining by phone, you can raise and lower your hand by dialing *9, then unmute and mute yourself by dialing *6. You can also include any questions or comments in the chat that we'll be monitoring. And as Marco said, we do have Spanish interpretation available for Spanish speakers. We have a button at the bottom of your Zoom screen with a globe icon, and you can click Spanish and to join the Spanish channel. And unfortunately, language interpretation on Zoom is not available for those calling in by phone, so you'll have to join on your computer. To all panelists and participants, please be sure to speak clearly and steadily for our interpreters to understand and interpret. And last but not least, please note that this meeting is being recorded and the recording will be shared publicly online. And that's it. I will pass it back over to Cynthia. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to go on the page, but these are the rules. Thank you, Cynthia.
Thank you. I'm just going to turn off my video here so that I'll have more of a stable connection. So good morning. My name is Cynthia Babbage. I'm the director of the Del Amo Action Committee, a grassroots community group working in the unincorporated Los Angeles County for over 28 years. I'm also the co-coordinator, along with Robina Sewell, for the Los Angeles Environmental Justice Network, which was formed by frontline environmental justice communities and advocates over 17 years ago. We have been meeting monthly since then to mentor and help each other with issues in common, as well as ones specific to the communities we serve. We have worked together on toxic tours, ground truthing projects, groundwater convenings, rulemakings at several different agencies, policy and legislative issues, as well as these EJ enforcement symposiums, this one being our 8th. Over time, our group have been joined in these efforts by many partners from state, local, and federal agencies, regulators, academics, and many others. We seek participation from individuals who are acting change agents for environmental justice in the circles they work in. The past 11 years, we have focused on problem solving around many of the issues we have been working for decades by applying boots on the ground knowledge to agency policy goals. We hope these efforts will help attain environmental clarity, which we believe will lead us to equity justice for our communities. We have found that to build a common ground, it is critical to create safe spaces like our symposiums. as we work to explore and understand different perspectives and approaches to protecting our environmental justice communities and the health of all Angelenos. We are called to collectively sense of action and our deep-rooted desire to what is needed to save our environmentally impacted communities. We have a team of community and agency representatives within the Los Angeles Environmental Justice Network that plan our symposiums. This year's team is comprised of Robina Sewell, California Safe Schools, Stephanie Lewis, Department of Toxic Substance Control, Jessica Brown and Rosa Borelli, Los Angeles City Attorney, Todd Sachs and his enforcement team, and Deldy Reyes, California Air Resources Board. Katie Butler, Senior Health Deputy, Office of Supervisor Janice Hahn, Joe Liu, Coalition for Clean Air, myself and Florence Caribbean from the Del Amo Action Committee, Jennifer Malone, Los Angeles County General Counsel, Kristen McKinley, and Rachel Z. Willinger, California Environmental Protection Agency, and Susanna Ludigas, the Los Angeles Regional Water Quality Control Board. Creating the space to hear each other will allow us to continue to develop solutions in collaboration. This is that kind of space. We believe this will lead to real and measurable change in the policies of agencies charged with the protection of our most vulnerable communities. We have over 110 registered today. Who is in the room with us today? We have 16 representatives of environmental justice and community advocacy groups, 6 universities and unions, 4 consultants and foundations, 3 enforcement agencies and prosecutors, 5 water protectors, 2 air regulation agencies, 9 state and federal agencies, 2 Los Angeles County departments, 2 Los Angeles City departments, and 5 local and state federal representatives. The continued support of symposium sponsors provides the resources to allow community voices to take a lead role in our series of virtual discussions around the nexus of environmental justice and enforcement. We would like to thank them. Community Environmental Services, California Air Resources Board, Earth Justice, Los Angeles City Attorney, California Environmental Protection Agency, Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors Sheila Kuehl, Janice Hahn, Holly Mitchell, and Hilda Solis, South Coast Air Quality Management District, Cal Recycle, and the Los Angeles Environmental Justice Network, who with open ears and a passion for justice welcomes you to this space. It is now my pleasure to introduce Katie Butler, a long-standing partner in the Los Angeles Environmental Justice Network and all-around amazing woman who will be the moderator for today's panel discussion. She is the Senior Health Deputy for Supervisor Janice Hahn. In this role, she oversees a portfolio of health and environmental projects and develops policy to improve health conditions for 4th District residents in Los Angeles County. By training, Katie is an environmental epidemiologist and a board-certified environmental toxicologist. Prior to joining Team Hahn, she led the Department of Public Health's response to environmental incidences, including Aliso Canyon gas blowout, chromium-6 emissions from plating facilities, and emissions from neighborhood oil drilling. She directed the county's community risk reduction program that was focused on preventing environmental threats in environmental justice communities. She received her Bachelor of Science degree in Environmental Sciences with a minor in Latin American Studies from the University of Notre Dame, and her Master's in Public Health with an emphasis on occupational and environmental epidemiology from the University of Michigan. Katie, I will now turn it over to you.
Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. I really appreciate your leadership. You and the EJ Network, along with many of the people I see here in the audience today, are truly change agents. And it's an honor to be the moderator for the workshop today. So I am a board certified toxicologist, and I'm also a mom. So I mentioned that because I have 2 daughters So professionally and personally, this topic of lead is important in all aspects of my own life, and I know it's important to all of you. And as Cynthia mentioned, we have a great group here today. Thank you for joining to hear from our panelists on lead exposure, prevention tips, what actions people can take when exposure does occur. And this is the second workshop of this year's enforcement symposium. So let's keep enforcement top of mind as we listen to today's presentations. For example, how are communities protected when lead exposure occurs? Who enforces these protections? What kinds of resources exist, and what actions can people take on their own? What are tools that people and communities need so they can be empowered to take action? So the purpose of today's workshop is really to create awareness about lead toxicity. Again, what actions people can take on their own. I know many of us have been working for years to advocate for cleanup of communities around Exide Battery Plant and also around Quimetco. These legacy sources of lead contamination in LA County certainly sparked the need for this workshop on lead. And today we want to showcase what actions communities can take. So we won't be diving into the specifics, and I know there's many specifics, and we could probably spend a month-long workshop on Exide and Quimetco. Today we won't be diving into those site-specific issues. We'll be focusing more on what communities can do to prevent lead exposure, what resources exist. And when you or your child is faced with an elevated lead level, what does that mean? What do you do? So again, thank you everyone for joining. I'm going to kick us off with an introduction to lead. So putting my toxicology hat on and giving us a primer on lead toxicity, exposure, common sources of lead, especially in consumer products that are good to be aware of, and how to report them. So thank you, everyone. Next slide. I thought it would be helpful to take a historical perspective on lead. It's been used by humans for many, many purposes for more than 5,000 years, actually dating back to ancient Egypt, when eyeliner called kohl was used as makeup, and that contained very high levels of lead. So it's a very versatile metal that's been used for many years. So this excerpt describes lead poisoning from the Roman Empire, and I'll pick out a few words here that show sort of the classic signs of lead poisoning. The third line there, palsy with shaking head and tottering knees. So evidenced even in the Roman ages that the classic sign of lead poisoning was impacts and is impacts to the nervous system. And people would often display, drop wrist because of radial nerve damage, and bloated dropsy, a staunch Scott's disease, consumption pale with keen but hollow eye. So abdominal pain was another classic symptom of lead poisoning, and seizures, loss of appetite, irritability, and just overall decrease of mental capacity. So it was quite common for Romans to be exposed to very high levels because their entire plumbing system was made of lead pipes. So the Romans were very much aware of these severe impacts of lead, but what they didn't realize at that time was that even very low level exposure could be detrimental to health. And that's something we now know, that even everyday, very low level exposure can lead to serious health consequences, especially for children. Next slide. So the historical uses, some of you may be aware of how lead has been used over the ages in makeup, as I mentioned, paints, and we'll dive into that a little bit later, but paint is a very common source of lead, and it was actually used as a spermicide for informal birth control. And now we know lead exposure does have impacts on fertility for people that are exposed to high levels of lead. Lead has a very sweet taste, and we hear nowadays that that sweet taste can be an attractive thing for children, and so that sweet taste was used in the Roman ages and even medieval and Renaissance ages as a food sweetener, and it was added to wine to make wine taste better. And of course, it was used in cups, plates, pots, pans, and still is used in ceramics in other countries. Of course, lead coins, as I mentioned, lead pipes, very common to use lead in pipes, and then gasoline in our more modern industrial age was one of the top exposure sources over the last few decades, until the 1970s, when it was started, the EPA started phasing out leaded gasoline. And interestingly enough, once lead gasoline consumption started to decrease in the 1970s, we saw dramatic decreases of blood lead levels in the US population. So just to give you an idea, 1970s blood lead levels would average, or we at least saw blood lead levels higher, around 12 micrograms per deciliter. And in 2016, the CDC saw those drop to less than 1 across the US population. So that decrease in leaded gasoline did have a tremendously positive impact on blood lead levels across the US. Next slide. So modern uses, lead acid batteries make up 88% of the US lead consumption, and lead is commonly found in ammunition, which we'll have another presentation to focus on that a little bit later. Oxides in glass and ceramics, casting metals, and sheet lead. So it still has many purposes today. Here's a picture of galena, which is the natural mineral form of lead sulfide, and this is where the ore of lead comes from. The largest galena deposit is in the state of Missouri. So it's widely processed to make batteries and oxides in stained glass and ceramics especially. So it's in high demand still these days. Next slide. So this depicts the common exposure pathways that that can impact especially children in the home. So you see from the window coming industrial emissions and auto emissions, especially when gasoline was leaded, and the air can carry those deposits into the home, and of course that's an inhalation hazard for children who are breathing air in and around outside the home. Of course, lead in paint can also be picked up by children, and most commonly, the lead in paint falls, gets accumulated rather in dust. So, the dust that's around the baseboards or on the windowsills is really one of the more common places for children to pick up lead and then transfer the lead from their hands to their mouth, and ingest the lead that way. So, lead dust on toys, the same way that it accumulates on the baseboards and the windowsills, the lead dust can also accumulate on toys and provide a source of exposure. Lead in old pipes can transfer to the water, and people can be exposed through drinking water. And then, lead in food, and I'll give some examples of that later, where, lead can be found in food, and that can be a concern in some candies, medicines, teas, and it's important to really read labels and understand where food additives are coming from. This picture also shows lead solder in cans, which was banned in 1995. So that's no longer a common source, but if cans are imported from other countries, it's possible to still find lead in cans, but it's banned in the US. Next slide. So, once a child or an adult or a pregnant woman is exposed to lead, here are some of the common health effects. Damage to the brain and nervous system is, very, very, it can happen at low levels, as I mentioned. So low exposure levels can cause damage to the brain and nervous system, especially in children. And children can absorb lead more easily than adult bodies do. And learning and behavior problems can result because of lead impacting the brain. At much higher lead levels, lead can damage all organs, essentially, the kidneys, the blood system, the nervous system, and lead to coma, convulsions, or death at very, very high levels. So there is no safe level of lead that has been identified, and that's sort of the take-home message here, is that there's no safe level of lead, even at very, very low levels. Lead can be harmful. And what really makes lead so effective in how it is harmful to the human body is that it really operates in the body by replacing calcium, magnesium, and lead. So, our bodies and our cells, they run regular cognitive functions by using, those minerals, calcium, magnesium, and zinc, and lead will interfere by replacing those. So it kind of swaps out for the calcium, and then that's how, the messages in our body really get interrupted very, very severely by lead. And so it interferes with those basic building elements of our body, and really quite literally becomes sort of this dead weight in our bodies. And it never fully leaves the body. So lead will circulate the body in the blood for about a month, and then it will stay in the brain for years, and impact the mental functioning. And then the rest is actually stored in teeth or bone. So when a woman is pregnant and during breastfeeding, the lead in bone actually is freed, and then it becomes a risk for newborns. So as scientists estimate that lead from bones might even account for as much as 70% of the lead burden in older adults. So there is some concern that older adults who maybe were exposed to lead at a younger age may be at higher risk for certain diseases like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's. Next slide. So going back to some common sources, some consumer products where we find lead as well. So chipping paint, one of the top sources of lead in a household. Medicinal remedies and that are sold in other countries can contain lead and imported here. Lead can be found on hair, skin, shoes, and clothes after working, after doing renovation in a home that has lead paint. That can be a very common source of tracking lead inside the home. In bullets and fishing sinkers, some toys can contain lead, whether it's lead in the paint or maybe other metal materials on the toys. It can be found in jewelry and candies. They are dirt, as we know from industrial deposition that can occur, and traditional makeup, dishes, pots, and then foods and brightly colored spices, some mostly imported from outside the US. Next slide. So here's a poster from our LA County Department of Public Health that just depicts some snacks and candies that have been found to contain lead. So this was last updated in 2019, and it gives you some examples of some snacks from India that contained lead, and all of these brands were recalled, or consumer alerts were put out about these brands of candies and snacks. Next slide. Next slide. And earlier this year, February 2022, the Attorney General Rob Bonta actually issued a consumer alert because so many of these candies were testing positive, were testing for high levels of lead, particularly in this kind of dried plum fruit and candy. So we have laws in California that prohibit the sale of candy under Proposition 65. These candies can not be sold, and so it was kind of so widespread and such a high concern that the Attorney General actually issued this warning, and then provided information for people to report any businesses that were selling the candy, because businesses were asked to pull all of them off the shelf. And so if consumers saw them still on the shelf, they could report that to the Attorney General. So that gives you an idea of enforcement action that was taken when these kinds of candies are found on the market, and then the kind of action that consumers can take to report it. And I'll provide those websites in just a moment to report issues. Next slide. So I did want to mention this popular trend of glitter dust in baked goods. We see them a lot in cupcakes and cakes and donuts. And so, it's important for us to understand, okay, some glitter dusts are safe, but some are not. And how do you really know the difference? They're attractive, right? It makes the birthday celebrations fun. This luster dust is widely used, but a few years ago, this caused metal poisoning in children at a birthday party in both Rhode Island and Missouri, and the children became ill after attending a friend's birthday party. Their symptoms were vomiting, diarrhea that began in just a few hours after consuming the glitter dust. And those symptoms lasted for about 10 hours. One person did have to go to the emergency room for treatment, and then it was identified that this birthday cake with the gold dust was the source of lead poisoning in the children. So I want to draw everyone's attention to the picture on the lower left. It says gold dust. It says non-toxic. And so that can be really misleading for consumers because non-toxic gives people the impression that it's safe. But non-toxic really does not mean that it's edible. Next slide. So it's important to check for the edible label on decorative food items. This is another cake at a 1-year-old party that had rose glitter dust, and it also had high levels of lead in it. And so the FDA does require all food additives to list the ingredients, and it's important to check for that edible label. So not to rely on a non-toxic label, and make sure that any kind of food additives are food grade or edible. Next slide. Okay, so we've talked a lot about how harmful lead is, even at low levels. So I want to share a bit of good news that, you know, the CDC, they consider lead poisoning 100% preventable. And here are some of the top ways that you can protect children from lead exposure. The number one way being getting a blood lead test and talking to your child's doctor about a blood lead test, because that's the best way to really understand if any kind of lead exposure is happening. And then number two, you know, talk with LA County Department of Public Health, and we'll have a couple presenters from the Department of Public Health on later to provide some more information. But they're a good resource to understand how you can test paint and dust or other sources in your home. So they have a hotline, 1-800-LA-4-lead. Renovate safely. So hiring trained contractors is important. We talked about how lead can be brought in the home from hair and clothes and shoes after, you know, working on a job that involves lead paint, or renovating a house that has lead paint. Avoid certain consumer products, candies and toys. So just being really vigilant to look at ingredient lists, look for you know, the labels, not relying on non-toxic. Recalls are posted on a government website that you can check, and that's cpsc.gov. Inside the home, you know, general good practice is number 5, to regularly wet mop floors. Use a HEPA vacuum if possible, but wet mopping the floors, windows, and windowsills is a good practice to make sure there's not any dust that has lead and is accumulating inside the home. 6, leave shoes by the door or outside. 7, shower or change clothes and shoes after working with lead-based products. So if you have a hobby, or someone in the family has a hobby that has lead oxide paint, you know, important to really wash up after using those. Protect soil with grass, mulch, or wood chips. So soil that's contaminated with lead in backyards or around the neighborhood, you know, doing whatever we can to prevent little ones especially from coming in contact with that soil. So it may mean a raised, you know, sandbox or other kind of designated area that's separated from potentially contaminated soil. So these are the 8 ways the CDC recommends. I'm going to add a 9th way, number 9, and that's eat a healthy diet. It's really important to have good nutrition to lower the lead absorption. So we talked about how lead will insert itself into our building blocks of our body and kind of like dress up like calcium and pretend it's calcium in our body. So if our children are getting enough calcium, vitamin C, iron in their diets, then it helps to keep lead from being absorbed. So it's kind of a good added tip here. And lastly, next slide, I'll just go over that recalled website a bit. I went to it yesterday to see what was posted, and I'll share a few products to give you some ideas of everyday products that are recalled because they're found to have lead. And if you ever see any of those recalled products on the market, you can file a complaint, and the health department for the state also has a food and drug branch complaint form online. Next slide. So here's 3 recent recalls. This Nuke brand of glass baby bottles was found to have paint on these star designs on the bottle, actually had trace levels of lead paint in them. So that was recalled after 100 were sold on the market. These Aflac plush toys come in a variety of cute little dressed up versions of the Aflac duck. Those had lead paint in some of the features of the toy, and then this advent calendar as well had lead paint, and that was recalled as well. So, you know, I think the point here is that, you know, lead paint can find itself, even though we do have regulations to prevent lead in our common everyday materials, it can still find its way in them. And then, you know, the recalls are in place to pull them off the market. And then there's reporting mechanisms for consumers to make complaints. And then that concludes my presentation. And I'm going to introduce our next speaker on sampling. Yeah, and I just saw a comment in the chat too about aviation fuel still containing lead. So that's a good point, and that is true. So that is another source of exposure for us from leaded jet fuel. And there are some studies on that. So thanks for pointing that out and bringing it up. All right, I'm going to introduce our next speaker. Okay, Martin Groen. We're so fortunate to have a lead inspector with us from the Department of Public Health. So Martin Groen is an environmental health specialist with the Los Angeles County Department of Public Health. He's in the Environmental Health Division. He's currently assigned to the Childhood Lead Poisoning Prevention Program, also known as CLIP. He's a supervising inspector and oversees a specialized team conducting elevated blood lead level investigations of children. So Martin, thank you, Mr. Groen, for joining us today. He has over 12 years of experience and he's been making a positive difference for hundreds of LA County families. He has over 23 years of public health experience. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree in environmental science from Washington State University. He is a California State Registered Environmental Health Specialist and Certified Lead Inspector. Thanks, Martin, for showing us some lead sampling techniques. I'll turn it over to you.
You're very welcome. Can anybody hear me okay? Okay. Oh, I just wanted to jump in and actually make a tiny correction. My daughter's in aviation and she will correct you. Avgas, which is the general aviation fuel used by small airplanes, is 100, it's called low lead. It's 100 octane low lead or LL, and that does contain lead. Jet fuel, by the way, is safe. I do not believe any jet fuel contains any lead, thank gosh. But Avgas, yeah, still does. Pretty interesting there. Okay, so my name is Martin Groen. Thank you for the introduction. I really appreciate that. If I have time, I'll go over the lead check swab, lead chemical test. But I do have a really great friend next to me, and it's the XRF. And I was going to demonstrate that in my short period of time here. Okay, I'm going to jump right in. See my screen here. The XRF is a great tool. It's a nice scientific instrument, and it's awesome to have in the field. It uses a technology called X-ray fluorescence. So it does use radiation to generate a little bit of energy to throw at a sample, like a wall, a floor that is painted. It's a non-destructive analytical technique used to determine the elemental composition of materials. Fancy jargon for this will tell us if there's any lead, and also other metals too, but this instrument's designed to check for lead. And with that, you see a little picture on the right in action, and I will actually demonstrate with it and show you on a wall behind me. We do have dosimeters that monitor our exposure to any radiation created by the instrument, which is very small. It's not imaging radiation, so very big difference there. Okay, oops, sorry. So anatomy of an XRF, I won't go into great detail here, as some of this is beyond my physics. However, so LA County Environmental Health uses an X-ray analyzer, and we use it to test specifically for lead in paint during our childhood lead poisoning investigations. So our EBLs that we investigate routinely throughout the week. It does actually test dust and soil too, and actually some non-housing items too. But we use it right now primarily for paint. It provides rapid on-site results. That's the main advantage of this nice scientific tool. So that locations of lead-based or lead paint hazards are accurately identified and reported immediately. So it's quite fast. Within seconds, you'll get a reading, and I'll show you that in a minute. Pretty nifty. So it does throw a little bit of energy, radioactive energy, very tiny. It's, I believe, 40 millicuries of cadmium-109. And it throws a little bit of energy, so it excites the lead atom that's present in lead-based paint. And a detector in the instrument gives us a reading. I don't know if you can see it really well, but it has a little screen here, and it gives us an actual readout of the lead. Routine XRF usage. So we use these XRFs. They're quite expensive and require a lot of training, and we have a few of these in our office to do our elevated blood lead level investigations for children. So we don't need these on routine housing inspections and complaint investigations. Our great California law, our regulations presume all properties built before 1978 have lead paint or lead on the property. So testing is not required by our agencies or property owners. Any property built before 1978 is automatically presumed to have lead in the structure unless testing determines otherwise. Property owners must presume that all surface coatings that paint, varnish, folks have to understand that any surface coating used before 78 could contain lead, and that does include varnishes, any other surface coatings besides paint. Let's say work practices must be followed when surfaces are disturbed by scraping or sanding. So when somebody does renovation, for instance, handy person, property owner, painter, and they start scraping away paint, if that is done incorrectly and inappropriately without containment in place, then you will get potentially contamination if the property was built before 1978. So that has to be done correctly. And that's a whole different presentation of lead safe work practices. Okay. Here's an X-ray analyzer, XRF, in use by one of our previous lead inspector assessors. You can see the house paint is very deteriorated. And so we will test deteriorated paint only, which is a lead hazard. if it was built before, if the structure was built before 1978. If paint's intact, that means that the paint is like the wall behind me, all nice and smooth, no chipping, peeling, cracking, etc. This is intact. This is good. So this could have lead-based paint on it with the highest amount, and it does not pose a hazard to anyone if it's left alone. So this we would not test because this does not pose a hazard at this time. Here's another examples of deteriorated paint, pre-1978 properties. So we will automatically presume that these are lead containing paint on this property. No testing needed. I like this picture because it has some containment there, plastic over a truck, but not on the ground, and they're scraping away the paint. Here's another inspector, one of our childhood lead poisoning prevention lead inspector assessors doing another investigation. And the paint is in really poor condition, as we would call it. So XRF user qualifications and requirements. What do you have to do to use one of these nice devices? Well, lots. Manufacturer safety and operational training and certification is required for each user. So we have to, it's not just a quick 5-10 minute video. We have to do, it's pretty much an all-day event to go through safety training, some online, some in person, where we will have hands-on work with the instrument to make sure that a user is qualified and proficient using it. We have to hold general and specific user licenses. That's for our agency, for any of these radioactive devices, and it has to meet local, state, and federal regulations. Users have to have radioactivity exposure monitoring, which is our dosimeters here. You might see these at when you go for an X-ray, dentist office, and I also am married to the XRF, that's my joke. We have a dosimeter ring on our finger, so when I use the instrument, if I'm exposed to any radiation, the ring dosimeter or extremity dosimeter catches that, and it's rare. We don't get anything beyond background typically. CDPH, that's California Department of Public Health, requires only certified lead inspector assessors, that's myself, or sampling technicians supervised by lead inspector assessors certified to use these devices in the field to do sampling or lead evaluations. So any type of lead inspection which uses an XRF required to be an inspector assessor, California State, or a sampling technician certified by CDPH too. So let me go ahead and jump into a demonstration. I have the instrument on, you all can see that. I don't know if you can see the screen or not really closely, possibly. We're gonna go ahead and do a demonstration right behind me. So let's see if this wall contains any lead. I think you can see that. I'm gonna have to stand up. And it's analyzing right now. Takes a couple seconds. And it'll beep to let me know it's done. Okay, just finished. And it just told me right now it is negative. I don't know if you guys, everybody can see that a little closely. It does show it's negative. It says the lead amount and it says 0.000. So very nice. Okay. I think I have a few more minutes here. We have also in our analysis lead chemical test kits. There are 3M test kits that we use that we've been trained on. No endorsement of 3M or the product. These are the ones that state allows us to use. And these can be used for checking, we call non-housing items like ceramics, like these, and we can check for lead, but they can also be used on buildings too. I'll show you the limitations on that. So there's one that's used on a building component, a window, and it does turn red. and that indicates there is lead. So I'll show you that. Here's the breakdown of that test kit. So the test swab is rubbed against a painted component, and on the top layer of paint, it'll analyze to see if there is a lead pigment or lead present in that paint. Its limitation is it only does the top layer unless the paint's scratched, and then the chemical will seep into the second and third layers. And that will let you know if there's any lead present in any of these layers. And there are the different color components. Okay, see that? So pros and cons of these chemical test kits, well, it's a mixed bag. Pros are it's an inexpensive test kit. No special training is required. It's very safe and easy to use. It's readily available online, multiple vendors, or in brick and mortar stores. I'm not sure who carries these. I haven't shopped for these. We get them bulk. Results are rapid within seconds. You can use it on multiple different surfaces. Painted, glazed tableware, like clay pots. An example here, we use these frequently on these imported glazed pots, usually from Mexico or other countries imported into the US. Our XRF cannot test these because there's issues with its discrimination of lead into clay. So we don't use these, they don't use the XRF on these items. Cons, test only the top layer of paint unless you scratch the surface. So you're going to cause damage to the surface by scratching it. And that will go down to the multiple layers of paint underneath. Results are qualitative. So you're only going to get a color indication from from basically a tiny tinge of pink to bright red. And this will not tell you conclusively we have lead-based paint on a particular component you're testing. It just tells you the presence of lead. You might get false positive and false negative results can occur. Cannot be used to test on any component that's painted red or pink because the indicator is red. It also may permanently stain surfaces. So you can get a stain on a surface from this chemical test kit and hard to wipe off. I've dropped this on my clothes and it does not wash out. Okay, all right, I think I have completed my presentation. I try to keep it to 10 minutes. There's a lot of information on these particular items, and I think I've covered a nice demonstration of these. And I think we'll be able to answer questions probably later. You can reach out to our office. Oh, it's missing the Y. At this telephone number down here. Okay. I believe
Thank you, Martin. Yeah, I really appreciate that demonstration. Both tools, the XRF and the lead check, really helpful. And so again, can you clarify where people might be able to find the lead check sampling test strips?
Sure. Right, these puppies you can buy online. You can go to, I believe, 3M's website and go to and look up lead checks. There are 3M lead check swabs, and there's multiple distributors for these swabs online and also in. I'm not sure about brick and mortar stores. These might be a little harder to find. We buy them through Granger. They're a county vendor. There are other vendors too that sell these online, and no endorsement of any particular vendor. And they're not. I wouldn't say they're cheap, but they're quite a bit inexpensive compared to hiring a lead inspector to do these type of testing. Well, with the XRF, right.
Great, thank you so much.
So, yeah.
Okay, well, yeah, that's great. And I'll introduce the next presenter, and we'll keep moving along here. So Dr. Jill Johnston is an associate professor and director of Community Engagement in the Division of Environmental Health at the University of Southern California. Her research focuses on addressing unequal exposures to harmful contaminants that affect the health of working poor and communities of color. Dr. Johnston engages in collaborations with grassroots organizations to conduct community-engaged, action-oriented research at USC to support environmental justice. She works towards strong partnerships with local organizations, community health promotores, and policymakers and residents to address air pollution, upstream oil and gas extraction, and incompatible land use. Previously, she's worked as a community organizer on issues of environmental and economic justice in South Texas. Dr. Johnston received her PhD in environmental sciences and engineering from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where she studied hazardous waste sites and industrial animal production. So thank you, Dr. Johnston, for joining us today. Really appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much, Katie, and thank you to everyone who helped organize this event and for the invitation to be here. So I'm going to talk and build on some of the discussions that Katie started earlier around, understanding some of the legacy sources of lead contamination in our communities, sort of how some of it's regulated, and then what it can mean for health. So if you go to the next slide. And then the next one. So Katie covered a great background on the impacts and harmful impacts of lead. So I will go over this very briefly. But we know lead can be harmful to sort of almost all the organ systems in our body. Next slide. And increasingly, from sort of scientific and big health studies, it's very clear that there's no safe level of lead. So this means that any exposure to lead can result in a harmful health outcome. So for example, birth weight or loss of IQ points. And really these low levels of exposures can actually have very big impacts when we look across the entire population. So even a little bit of exposure of lead or its presence in the environment can result in sort of a big loss of IQ points when we look across whole communities. Next slide. Also, there's been some kind of new approaches out there that allows for more imaging of the brain. And so in these studies, it's really been able to further provide evidence that lead impacts sort of the frontal cortex or the parts of the brain that really impact thinking, cognitive development, impulse control. And we see this effect stronger in males than females. We also see that the harmful impact is bigger in youth that grow up in environmental justice communities compared to other wealthier or less polluted communities. And we have seen strong associations between exposure to lead and outcomes like ADHD, as well as criminal behavior. So next slide. And sort of basically what all this means, all the sort of health data and epidemiology out there, is that preventing lead exposure is really key because it's really hard to reverse some of the impacts. And we see that some of the harm can happen during pregnancy. And so thinking about comprehensive approaches to really reduce exposure and get lead out of the environment is really critical for protecting public health. The other thing we know with that is some of these impacts can be intergenerational. Because lead is stored in bodies, then some of that can be passed on through fetuses and babies and sort of impact future generations. So next slide. The other aspect of some of the chemical properties of lead is that it does not easily disappear or go away. So even though we have phased out lead from many sources like gasoline and paint, it can still remain in our environment, especially in the soil. And then if the soil translates or comes into your home, it can also be in the dust. We also know that lead in pipes can deteriorate if it's still there. And as the pictures were shown just before, that deteriorating lead paint is also a place where we can get exposed. And once it gets into the soil or into the dust, it can stay there for a really long time. Next slide. And another thing to note is that we still use a lot of lead, specifically in car and truck batteries. And oftentimes we're not mining lead anymore in the US, but we're recycling it, like when we exchange a car battery or a truck battery. And the US continues to recycle about 20% of the world's batteries. But these activities are concentrated in only a few communities across the US. And so that means that these communities really face the largest burden from harmful impacts to the air and the soil near them. So next slide, please. And so now I just want to share a little bit about some collaborative work that was done in the community around the Exide lead acid battery smelter in sort of the East Los Angeles area with East Yard Communities for Environmental Justice and other local organizations. So next slide. So these just share some pictures of what happens at these lead acid battery smelters or these lead recycling facilities. Essentially, batteries are trucked in. They're brought inside, they're melted in these really large kettles. And through this process, oftentimes there's emissions through the stacks. And because of the properties of lead, oftentimes lead will attach to small particles or really tiny bits of dust. And then that can sort of go out the stacks and sort of rain down onto local communities around it and settle onto roofs or onto the soil in the nearby areas. And so this smelter in Vernon specifically was operating since the 1920s as some sort of metal facility. And they were processing about 25,000 batteries every day. So next slide. So in this community, it was surrounded by multiple sort of residential areas and neighborhoods, and they were processing about 120,000 tons of lead every year. And we know that even though it was operating in the city of Vernon, there was many sort of residential neighborhoods all around it. So next slide. And also, I think it's really important to recognize the role and the agencies of local communities in understanding and identifying a lot of the hazards that are located nearby. So it was really through organizing in the community that identified Exide as having an adverse impact on the community. And through their mobilization and organizing that really moved towards accountability around this facility. Sort of ensuring that there was soil lead testing in the area, and then ultimately having this facility shut down. So it was shut down in May of 2015. It's still an ongoing issue, as I'm sure may come up with questions around cleanup, both of the site and in the community. But that sort of in lieu of jail, the facility shut down and actually later declared bankruptcy, but sort of left this toxic legacy in the neighborhood. Next slide, please. And so this just shows some of the soil lead data that came from the testing of the state in these nearby residential areas. So the state of California, OEHA, has established 80 parts per million as sort of a threshold for what's considered acceptable in the state of California. And we see the vast majority of soil in this area tested higher than that, with many homes above 400 or even above 1,000 parts per million. So next slide. And so with the community, we They want to understand more about what sort of some of the long-term impacts of this facility could be in the neighborhood. And so when we started discussing this and collaborating, it was after the facility already shut down. And when you measure blood lead levels, that really only reflects the last several weeks of exposure. But as was mentioned earlier, lead can store in bones in the body, and sort of teeth is one of those things where lead can get stored. So as teeth are growing in utero, it incorporates a lot of both minerals that are in the mother's body, as well as some of these toxic metals. So actually it can begin, babies begin to incorporate lead in their teeth as they start to grow, which happens around the second trimester of pregnancy. And another aspect of teeth is they grow like tree rings. And so you can kind of get a timestamp to understand during certain weeks of pregnancy and early childhood what some of the exposures in the body look like in terms of lead and these other metals. Another thing with teeth is oftentimes as kids lose them, then parents and caregivers will save the teeth. So there's sort of these living record that exist of historical exposure to some of these toxic metals that we were able to leverage and get a better picture about what may be happening in this community. Next slide. So through kind of a lot of volunteers in the community and work to get people to engage and participate in this, we collected teeth that had already fallen out from children who spent their whole life in this community around Exide. And this just summarizes some of our basic findings, which is essentially that the higher the level of lead in the soil, we saw higher levels of lead in the teeth. So this again makes this connection between what is happening in the environment and specifically in the soil and what is happening in mothers' bodies and essentially passing along to babies. And so we saw this correlation among the participants that helped to show and demonstrate that soil is an important pathway of exposure to lead. Next slide. And sort of, just to summarize, we saw that the more lead in the soil, the more lead in the teeth, which is sort of just an indicator of the types of lead exposures that babies were facing both during pregnancy and in early childhood, and is also a reflection of the amount of lead that may be in the mom's body as well. And although there's not a lot of studies, there's now more that use sort of teeth as a marker of lead exposure. We've seen that these communities were much higher, about twice as high than lead in teeth from other urban areas in the US. Next slide. And so thinking a little bit more about prevention. Next slide. Sort of one unique aspect of lead is it's actually one of the chemicals that's regulated more so than many of the thousands of other chemicals that we may be exposed to every day. But there's a lot of different agencies, and many of them are somewhat siloed that look at lead in different ways. So for example, there's agencies that look at the air emissions or air pollution from these facilities, looking at the hazardous waste, so looking at lead once it goes into the soil. Those like the County of Public Health that do childhood blood lead testing. There's also sort of regulations and of occupational exposures to lead. So people that may be working inside these battery facilities or removing lead paint. And then finally, in this case, around Exide, there were multiple different cities as well as unincorporated county areas that had residents that were all impacted by this. So in many ways, a lot of these agencies don't talk to each other and don't share data. And sort of this is sort of one of the limitations we see with trying to identify communities or like neighborhoods that may be more at risk of these exposures to lead. And the next slide. And just one of kind of the important things is that preventing lead is actually, a big economic benefit to the state, because when we look at just exposures of lead, even though it continues to decrease, it's still a huge cost around like lost earnings that happen because of the impacts of these exposures. So next slide. So just a couple recommendations is also kind of the importance of sort of systematic data collection. So being able to review and look at, blood lead data, occupational data, pollution data, right, to really help identify high risk areas and prioritize for different sort of preventative and interventions. Understanding systematic testing of both children and workers, because we know there's a lot of gaps across the state of California, and making sure that all children are tested for lead exposure. And then really making sure that these locations and facilities that are using and emitting lead are really systematically tracked to make sure that they're fully regulated, right? And we don't more of these cases where we're allowing facilities not to meet the sort of highest standards of environmental regulations. And then next slide. So we know that lead poisoning is really preventable. And so sort of the identification and elimination of major sources of lead is really important. Abating lead hazards in homes, thinking about our lead service lines that bring water to houses, thinking about aviation gas, right? These small planes that we were just talking about that also operate a lot in LA County, bullets, wheel weights, there's other sources where lead continues to be used. And then sort of making sure that we're using and implementing best available control technologies with any industries that continue to use or process lead. So with that, thank you, and just want to acknowledge several of the supporters on some of this work. So I'll pass it back to you, Katie.
Thanks, Jill. Thank you so much. And I saw some excellent questions in the chat, and we have some time to open it up for questions on your presentation. And then if there's any questions on sampling too, I think Martin is still on. So I'm going back to the chat to start with the questions that people typed in. So Dr. Johnston, can the impacts of lead, such as ADHD, happen to adults or children or only fetus? And if one person is impacted by lead, can that be genetically passed on to their children?
Sure. So most of the studies right now look at exposure to lead during childhood. So either based on markers in the mom or sort of blood samples taken during early childhood, and then looking at what kind of diseases they develop later in life. So right now, most of the work around ADHD does look specifically at childhood exposures, but there's been some new studies that have come out that look at older adults and look at exposures and risk of cardiovascular disease, and find that elevated exposure to lead is similar to smoking cigarettes. So we do see adverse impacts with exposure later in life as well. And then, was there a second part to that I missed?
Thanks. Yeah, so the second part is, if someone is impacted by lead, then genetically can that pass on to their children? So maybe an epigenetics effect, or I guess you covered, the passing on through teeth. So maybe you can just expand a little bit more the genetic impacts.
So definitely the pregnant person, their exposure to lead and the lead that's currently circulating in their body or stored in their bones can impact the growing fetus. I don't know if there's been larger epigenetic studies that would look at maybe paternal exposures. Do you know of anything, Katie?
Yeah, I haven't heard of anything either. So I'm mainly aware of the passing on through the lead stored in bones, like you mentioned. And that's the major route it passes on to children. Yeah. And then you touched on this next question a bit on any data on long-term exposures showing up in seniors. So you mentioned the cardiovascular impacts and that those studies.
Hearing loss is another impact, and we also kind of see those in older populations. Some of these cognitive declines. So yeah, we see, and these are focused on really lower level exposures and impacts that can carry like through the life course.
Mm-hmm. And I saw some studies with linkages to Alzheimer's and possibly Parkinson's, but I think that's still a developing area of research because, like you mentioned, most of the studies do focus on children.
Yeah, I think yeah, that's right. Looking at cognitive decline and some of these outcomes is definitely an emerging area, and they are seeing evidence of lead playing a role.
Great, and then thank you for touching, on Exide. I don't think we can have a lead workshop without mentioning Exide, and so it was good to get that high level information from you, and wanted to point everybody into the direction of the chat. Cynthia, thank you for providing the information on the DTSC community meeting coming up. So that's tonight from 6 to 8 p.m. to update on the Exide cleanup project. So that information is there for anyone who might be interested to join and raise questions or concerns. So back to questions. Let's see. Mark, do you want to go ahead and go off mute and ask your question about the 80 parts per million, just to clarify what your question is there? You're asking if 80 parts per million.
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. Thanks, Katie. You had mentioned the 80 parts per million threshold that DTSC was using in the Exide community. Do you agree that that was an appropriate threshold?
So just to clarify or make sure I was clear, the 80 parts per million is set by OEHA, so the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessments. And that's based on their analysis of the data that suggests 80 parts per million of lead in the soil could lead to a 1 microgram per deciliter increase in blood lead levels. So that's how they set this more health screening level for soil lead. Right now, DTSC, it initially started with cleaning up homes that tested above 400 parts per million. And I think now it's around 230 parts per million that are eligible for a cleanup. I'm not sure if that's shifted more recently. So I think DTSC has still not yet sort of cleaned up homes that are above 80, but I know because there's this strong evidence of impacts of soil lead on health, there's definitely a desire from many people that live in that area to see all homes above 80 get cleaned up.
Thanks, Jill. And then we have a question about clothing and lead in clothing. Thanks, Molly, for submitting that to understand whether lead is found in clothing, like what was found in Sheen products, and how is that absorbed by the body. So when I was on the Recall website looking at the lead consumer products, there were some clothing products listed on that Recall website for lead in paint, in the paint that's used to color the fabrics. So I know that can be a source. I wasn't familiar with the Sheen products. Jill, do you know anything about that? Okay.
No, I don't. I would pass that to you, Katie.
Yeah. But so how are they absorbed? I think we could address that. Again, it's the same routes that are concerning, when you find lead in dust. So, lead in a fabric paint could easily rub off, and then you could have hand to mouth, ingestion, right, Jill? Is that probably the primary way it would be absorbed by the body? Incidental ingestion. But yeah, we'll have to look into that Sheen products. Sorry, I'm not up on fashion, so I'm not sure. But that does sound concerning that they're popping up in maybe some of these online clothing lines. Okay, any other questions that I may have missed in the chat, or anyone want to raise any other questions at this time? Yeah.
Yes. I can't turn my video on. Anyway, can you hear me? It's William Coon.
Yes, William, we can hear you.
Yes,
Okay,
Bill.
so I have two major questions. First of all,
Oh, we heard you and now you're dropping off, so maybe you could repeat. Oh,
tin cans that are currently in the grocery store. How does the lead not get into the food? I think some are putting an interior lining, but I see no lining on the lid. And sometimes I open it up, there's stuff on the lid, I lick it. So my question is how is the lead not get into the food when they use a tin can? Now, my second question is about the paint on my house. I repainted my house about 10 years ago, and my house is era 1968, approximately. It was first painted then. So I sanded off the old paint and then reused non-lead paint on top of it. But the old paint did not get all the way sanded off. It was only the loose stuff. So now my paint is peeling again, and I'm afraid the lead is now showing. The lead paint, which was underneath, is now showing. So my question is, without hurting the wood underneath, which is some places down to the wood, I don't want to scrape off the wood so much, and I want to do a better job of removal of that paint. What do I use? Do I use a wire brush on a drill? But what is the best way? I mean, chemically remove it with mask, or that's my two questions. How to remove lead paint if I do it myself, and how to commercially do it. Who do I hire and what do they do? That's my second question. Thank you.
okay, thanks, William. Let's take the second question first. I think that's a really practical question that probably a lot of people have when they're doing any kind of work on their house. And, you know, I think the official recommendation from the CDC is to hire a contractor. But I mean, what if you do want to do it by yourself? Martin, can you chime in here on maybe best practices from the health department's perspective for renovation, like William's talking about?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for calling on me. So yes, you've come to the right place. I can give you the answers really quickly. Yeah. So what you need to do is if you do disturb any more surfaces on your house, disturb meaning that's just our term, scraping, sanding, wire brush is definitely disturbing the paint. What you want to do is you want to work wet. So if you do any type of that type preparation and preparing the surface, you need to put down plastic on the ground. That's 6 mil. That's the thickness of the plastic. It's called a mil spec. It's just thickness.
Yeah.
You put down the plastics 10 feet around your work area. You got a wall like my wall here. I'm going to put plastic 10 feet out away from that wall and put that on the ground. And then next, you're going to get a inexpensive water sprayer, and you're going to spray. Oh, I got a bucket here handy. You have to step out and do a quick demo. And you're going to spray the surface with a mist of water so you get it a little bit moist. And then you can go ahead and prep the surface by scraping or sanding. And all that loose material, like you said, the loose paint that's really old, that's not sticking anymore, is going to fall down flat on that plastic and lay down that plastic, and it's not going to be airborne as far as any dust is concerned. And that's what we call proper containment. You as a homeowner can do that yourself, and a painter or handyman, a handy person can do that also too. There's a federal requirement called RRP. That's a whole nother topic. However, And if you don't want to do the preparation, the scraping or the sanding, and by disturbing that surface, that's okay. You can just buy a good quality primer, a primer sealer from your favorite hardware store, and coat over that area and then repaint it. That way you're not disturbing the surface by scraping or peeling and creating any possible chances of dust from the presumed lead-based paint. Because you said your property was built in 1968. So we already presume you're going to have some lead-based or lead in that paint. I hope I answered some questions there.
Pretty good, yes.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Is
Martin. And then, oh, sorry, I was going to go back to your first question, William, or did you want to follow up on the renovation question? Okay, I'll go back to your first question. So, that's a good concern you have about lead in cans, and can it, food in cans can come in contact with the can for a long period of time, right? So there's a concern that whatever's in that can material is going to leach into your food. And so my understanding is in 1995, lead was banned from being used in cans. Martin or Jill, do you have any other comment on that question? So I don't think it's currently a concern, but maybe I'm missing something.
Right. We are not aware of lead being used anymore in canned food products. There is a seal or a coating that's inside of a can. It's coated. Usually these cans are made of iron, zinc, and I believe iron and zinc primarily. And there is a seal, a coating inside. Some of them do have BPA, a coating that resists corrosion inside the can. However, lead, as far as I know, has been curtailed in the production of these. I'm not sure what year. However, but I can tell you that we do not see these as a source of any lead poisoning when we do our investigations for children who are lead poisoned.
Great, thanks, Martin. And then someone in the chat asked whether lead can be found in urine and if that's a good way to test the lead levels in the body. So no, blood lead test is the best way. So stick with the blood lead testing to test you or your children for lead levels. And then this is the last question we'll take, and then we'll move on to our next presenter. Thank you, Martha. Does Mexican candy still contain lead? So yes, there's some candies that do have lead from Mexico. Many of those candies on the poster I showed from Public Health, they were imported from Mexico. Does it get tested? No, and I think that's the challenge. It should meet the FDA requirements and the Proposition 65 California requirement. No lead is allowed, but that's not always the case. So Martin or Jill, do you have any other comment on the candies and how to prevent exposure from candies?
CDPH, California Department of Public Health, does do screening and does buy candy off the shelf and does do batch testing of all types of candies besides the infamous Mexican candies. We had licorice that was also contained lead, American licorice that contained lead that was found on one of their testing. They do routine testing throughout the year. They don't test all candies on the shelf, but they do test batches of routinely.
Oh, that's great to hear. So then, Martin, do you know when they find lead, then that's when the health department locally is also notified? So we're aware on a local level. Do you know how that works?
Correct. There's a process in place that notifies local jurisdictions, and if there's any voluntary recall of these products, our health inspectors will make the proper actions. We'll do the proper actions.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And notifying.
Great. Okay. So we're going to move on to our next presenter, and then we'll take a short break after our next presenter, also from the health department. Let me pull up her introduction. So Janet Scully, thank you for joining us today, is a program manager with the Los Angeles County Department of Public Health, and she works in the Environmental Health Division. Had the privilege of working side by side with Janet, and I'm so glad that you're able to join today. She oversees many different initiatives, environmental justice initiatives, especially including one of the largest lead hazard remediation programs in the country. This was the result of a historic $305 million lead paint company settlement. So talk about enforcement, right? $305 million lead paint company settlement. Ms. Scully has been instrumental in the development and implementation of prominent program and policy strategies to improve health outcomes for children and families in disadvantaged communities throughout Los Angeles County. She has over 25 years of public health experience. She has a Bachelor of Science degree in nutrition from California State University, Sacramento, and a master's in public health from California State University, Long Beach. Thanks, Janet, for joining us. I'll turn it over to you.
Everyone, thanks, Katie, for the introduction. I'm so excited to be here. I've worked with many of you for decades, Cindy Babich. So it's really nice to be present and to talk about this exciting new program that we have. You can go to the next slide. So Lead Free Homes LA is a countywide lead paint remediation program. The $305 million historic settlement is statewide, so there are 10 jurisdictions across the state that were part of this litigation with 3 paint companies. And so we ended up settling, and LA County will receive approximately 134 million of that 305 total. It'll come to us in over 7 years. And we anticipate that we'll probably implement this remediation program for about 10 years. There's no set restriction on how long we have these funds. So we will run this program until we expend all the dollars. We started receiving funds in 2019, October. And so, that plus 7 years is how long we'll receive funds. These funds can be used to remediate the interior and exterior lead-based paint in county residents. And really, we're focusing on the hazard. So, chipping, peeling paint that is, really kind of breaking down. We're focused on the most vulnerable populations, so families who are most at risk for lead poisoning. And those are the homes and the families that we want to prioritize for these free services. And then we're working with our local childhood lead poisoning prevention program, our kind of a sister program in the department, prioritizing referrals from them so that we are remediating homes of kids who are already lead burdened. So that's really our top priority right now, is identifying those children who have elevated blood lead levels and remediating any lead paint hazards that might be in that home. This, as Katie mentioned, this program is the first of its size and scope, certainly in California and probably nationally. So we definitely are, planning and implementing this program with a sense of urgency, knowing that, lead poisoning due to paint hazards is completely preventable. And so we want to really focus on preventing kids from being poisoned in this way. Next slide. So I don't want to spend too much time here, but we actually have several different funding sources in LA County to do lead paint remediation. So we have the lead paint company settlement I mentioned. There's some details on the right column there. Going back to the left side, we have a HUD grant in LA County, and that's being managed by a sister program called the Los Angeles County Development Authority. So we're working very closely with them on Lead Free Homes LA. They're actually the organization that is, or the agency that is doing the implementation of our program, because they know how to do housing rehab. Public health, that's not really our thing. Like, we know how to keep a public health perspective in this program, but they know how to do this work correctly. And so we thought it was really important to partner with them to make sure that we're doing this work as effectively and efficiently as possible across the county. And then we have the Aliso Canyon settlement. And again, this gets a little tricky in explaining how we have, you know, a settlement from the Aliso Canyon gas leak for lead paint remediation in the Exide area. But we had attorneys who were very savvy, and this was part of that settlement with SoCalGas. So $5.2 million was earmarked for lead paint remediation, specifically for the communities that were impacted by Exide. Next slide. Okay, so as I mentioned, you know, we're really being very targeted in this work. So we're looking at areas in the county where there's a large pre-1951 housing stock, where there's a high prevalence of low-income families, and where there's a significant population of kids under the age of 6. And so we've looked at all those variables, and we have created maps that actually show those kind of target areas on a map. And so we're working in kind of a phased approach to kind of work our way throughout the county. And I'll talk a little bit more later about how we're batching those different geographic areas. And as I mentioned before, we're really prioritizing children who have an elevated blood lead level. Our kids under age 6 are at highest risk, so we're really focusing on them, and pregnant women, and certainly our environmentally disadvantaged communities where we're finding, you know, multiple lead sources that create, you know, a more advanced burden in those communities. Next slide. So I want to just put this in perspective a little bit. So in LA County, we have about over 720,000 properties that were built before 1951. So you see the SD is supervisorial district. So you can see how many homes approximately there are in each of the districts. And then, you know, we're looking at also, you know, low income families and kids under 6. So we're not looking to serve those areas in the county where they're well resourced and they can afford to do this work on their own. That is not our target audience for this. But we are anticipating that because of the high cost to do this work, we will likely be able to remediate 5,000 to 6,000 homes over the lifetime of the program, which is a great dent, but it really is just a dent in this issue, right? So we still need to do these other things, the education, the, you know, really making sure that folks are empowered to get their kids' blood lead tested. So all those other strategies are really going to come into play here, making sure that properties are being maintained, especially when they're rental properties. So this is not going to be the fix all, but it is a really great step in the right direction, I think, for our high risk communities. Next slide, please. So this is our recruitment strategy, and it's really kind of designed around a budget of about 20 million per year, with a minimum of 70% of the funds going to the actual remediation services. So we're kind of moving through communities in a phased approach. So in the Exide area, for example, we have started in that 1.6 mile radius, and then we moved up to East LA and Boyle Heights, and then we had a phase in Huntington Park. And we think by moving through communities in a phased approach, we're able to batch these homes, and then the construction contractors can just kind of hop from property to property in close proximity. So we can more efficiently use those dollars. If the construction companies and those teams have to commute all over the county, we can't do this work as efficiently. So we think we'll remediate about 500 homes per year. And we have this really nice strategy in place where we have partnered with community-based organizations in each of these areas across the county. And they are doing door knocking, they're doing mailers out to properties, they're doing follow-up door hangers. We're doing complementary media campaigns where we're doing some digital social media. We're doing some place-based ads where we're going, putting materials in convenience stores and doctor's offices, certainly childcare centers. And then there's some outdoor where we have some signage at on bus tails and bus shelters, things like that. So that's kind of the general approach to the program. Now, if this is a lead-burdened child, we will prioritize that family no matter where they are in the county. So that's the exception. Let's go to the next slide. So for those of you who know lead paint hazard remediation, it's very complex work, right? We have a lot of challenges with this work. We're asking a lot of residents, right? We're asking them to let these strangers into their home. So we have to build this trust with them. We're asking them when we're doing the work to be gone during the day because we want them to be safe. So we ask them either some homes we have to relocate for a few days, and some we just have to relocate during the day. And we work really closely with the families to make it as convenient as possible for them. But it's a tall order, and you know, recruitment is definitely, you know, it's difficult at times, especially in certain areas. And then the process is lengthy, right? So first, you know, the family or the property owner is submitting an application, and then it's getting reviewed to see if they actually qualify. Is the, you know, application complete, all of that, you know, all of that. And then we have the lead inspection where we're actually assessing for lead paint hazards. And then we do a site visit with an inspector. They look at all the hazards, and that is what helps to create the scope of work. And then we do another home visit to really talk through with the families, like what work is going to get done, where do they want to relocate to, you know, how can we best meet the needs of this family while we make their home more safe. And then we go into the construction work, which again, there should be no expenses to the family at all in this process. And so we just want to ensure that we're working closely with the families so that they're satisfied with this work that we're doing for them without too much hassle. I'll take the next slide. So this is our progress to date. And I just want to say that, you know, we had to pause for over a year because of COVID. And then, you know, as we were trying to get ramped back up, sometimes residents weren't ready for that, right? They weren't ready to let people back into their homes. They weren't ready to leave their homes to allow us to come in and do this work. So those are some of the challenges that we've been working on. And, you know, getting materials for the construction side of things has been really challenging. The cost of materials is more than it used to be. So, you know, I want to paint this very comprehensive picture. We have this great program, but there are a lot of complexities. So to date, we have a total of over 1,200 applications. Over 700 of those have actually been approved. We've had 582 units tested, and almost 550 of those with lead paint hazards. So I want to even point out there that we're finding that almost all of the homes that we assess, we're actually identifying hazards. that isn't what we expected. When we did a pilot program, it was much less. So we've had to kind of make some adjustments there because we're, we're actually needing to remediate more of these assessed homes than we thought. We have 301 active units. So that means they're in the process, right? So we're doing the job walks, we're doing the scopes of work, we're working with the families on the remediation and relocation plan. So they're somewhere in the process. And to date, we have remediated a total of 91 properties. So our goal by the end of the year is 250. And right now we think we're going to meet that goal. But again, with some of the challenges that we're experiencing, we're just really hopeful that we'll meet that goal. Next slide. And then I just wanted to point out, we do have a website, leadfreehomesla.com or hogareslibresdeplomola.com. So you can go to our website and find out, if you qualify for the program. You can give the website to the clients that you work with. You can, get additional information, what you need to know about lead. We link to our CLIP program here. We have lots of testimonials. We think that's the best way to get the word out about the program, is for folks to hear from residents who have had this work done, how simple it's been for them, how satisfied they are, and how much more safe they feel in their home environments. Next slide. And then these are just some educational resources I thought it would be helpful to share. They're actually linked in the PowerPoint. I assume it will be shared, so hopefully you'll be able to access these links. And I think the last slide is my final slide. So thank you, gracias. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Janet. Thank you so much. And yes, we'll be sharing the slides, so those links will be shared. Let's see, we can have maybe 5 minutes for questions before we go to a short break. Let's see, how are resources coordinated to ensure no cross-contamination? So, I mean, you outlined, it's can be a challenging process, right? The entire lead remediation process. So can you talk a little bit about coordination with other cleanups for the soil outside? How does that work, or how is that taken into consideration?
Yeah, specifically in the Exide area, we were coordinating with DTSC so that we were remediating homes after soil cleanup was complete. So right now we're not working in that 1.6 mile radius. We've already kind of been there. We'll loop back there again eventually, but for now we're kind of moving around around that 1.6 mile radius. But the contractors we use are certified in lead paint hazard remediation. So there should not, they contain the area and they're making sure that this work is done properly. LACDA also has inspectors that go out on site and make sure that the work is being done properly. So there are a lot of checks and balances in place.
Okay, great. Thanks, Janet. And then another question in the chat from Melissa is about whether the settlement money covers any of the medical costs, so seeking damages for health impacts caused by lead. Was that part of the settlement, or perhaps there's another settlement that addresses that?
No, I don't know of any settlement that actually covers that piece. What we are trying to do is, so we have the settlement funds in an interest-bearing account. So we are kind of generating interest funds. And what we're trying to use some of those funds for is to offer some blood lead testing in our most impacted communities. So we've hosted a few different events. We used to do this in the Exide area a lot. We've also done something sort of similar around Quimetco, but for communities where we're already connected and we're doing some work, say we're doing some door knocking, we're offering a resource fair, we definitely want to offer blood lead testing at those events too. So I am utilizing a small portion of the settlement funds to make sure that folks are getting blood lead tested.
Okay, thank you so much, Janet. And then lastly, so if someone, thinks they qualify, they meet those criteria, they can reach out to Lead Free Homes LA, and what's the best way for them to contact?
I would try the website first.
Okay.
If you don't feel like you're getting what you need there, my email is here. You can just send me an email and I'll help with that process. I just want folks to keep in mind, this is going to be implemented over 10 years. So if we're not in your community now, we will get there likely if you're, if you're part of that kind of target population that I mentioned. But and if you're not, like, speak up. We can always add additional communities. So I'm happy to hear from folks if you really want to make sure that we're going to be in your community.
Great, thank you. We appreciate the health department's work on this. And another question did pop up. Caroline is asking a good clarification question. Is the painting exterior only, or is it also addressing the interior?
Both.
Okay, great. So yeah, this addresses the exterior and interior painting if it has lead, right?
And some soil, primarily around the drip line, but we will remediate some soil also.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And we can replace windows and doors where it's warranted. Like, that's why, this work is really expensive if we're doing it well and we're doing it right, So every home is its own unique case.
Thanks, Janet. Yeah, and it's so important, like we heard in the earlier presentations, how this is the primary source of lead exposure for kids. So hoping to see some improvements in the actual blood lead data too, right, in 10 years down the road. Okay, great. Thanks, Janet. So we're going to go ahead and take about a 15-minute break. And it is noon, so we want to be respectful of maybe needing to grab a bite to eat or take a bathroom break. And so we'll convene back here at exactly 12:10. Okay, so stick with us. We'll be back at 12:10, and then we'll have 2 more presenters, and we'll leave some room for discussion at the end. So thanks again, everyone, and we'll be back here at 12:10.
Thanks, Janet. Thanks, Katie.
Okay, I hope everyone enjoyed their break. We're gonna get started back up here. Thanks, Helena, for bringing those slides up. Okay, I'm going to introduce our next speaker. Carlos Aguilar is the Director of Organizing for the Coalition for Economic Survival, CES. This is a grassroots, multi-ethnic tenants' right organization serving low and moderate income renters throughout the greater Los Angeles area, and it was founded in 1973. Carlos works with staff to ensure they have the support and tools necessary to advocate for the right of all tenants to have safe, healthy, and affordable housing. He works on program management and implementation for eviction prevention programs, such as Stay Housed LA and emergency rental assistance, as well as promoting healthy housing initiatives like child lead poisoning prevention, green cleaning, and integrated pest management, and tenant education and empowerment activities to address slum housing conditions. So thank you, Carlos, for joining us. Take it away.
Hi, thank you, Katie. Thank you for that introduction. Today, I want to put a little perspective on the conversations we've been having and find how we as a community can influence and have influenced a lot of these dynamics when it comes to lead and lead poisoning. So we're going to talk a little bit about how lead exposure, investigations, remediation have been influenced by community action throughout the years and what we can continue to do moving forward. Next slide, please. I think Katie described who we are as an organization. We are dedicated to ensuring tenants have healthy, safe, and affordable housing. So we can continue to the next slide. And some of our organizing efforts are focused around rent control, preserving affordable housing, stopping unjust evictions and displacement, eradicating exposure to lead paint, and combating other slum housing conditions and promoting healthy housing. Next slide, please. So community interventions for healthy homes have been going on for many, many years. And I believe it was, let's see, someone mentioned that efforts have been going on for decades. I think it was Dr. Johnson said, organized for decades to make sure changes happen. And that is exactly right. Even more than decades, more than one decade, several decades of continuous work through community-based organizations, moving on up to our governmental agency partners. And one of the things that we've found in challenges navigating the system have always been a barrier to our communities. And one of the barriers that we've been dealing with and we deal with as advocates is the lack of education on lead dangers to all children and to all residents. And then because there's very little knowledge of the history and impact. And today I hope to address some of that and hopefully change that, at least for the participants that are here today. It's commonly thought that lead is an East Coast issue. It's not so much a West Coast issue because, you know, we're newer, we've got newer buildings, you know, we don't have that historical pollution, but actually we do have some historical pollution, as was referenced earlier by Exide and some of the other programs, and also with the leaded gas that everyone suffered from. So that lack of knowledge and understanding does affect us. And as Martin said, California code says it's presumed to have lead. Your home that you live in is presumed to have lead if it's not been officially remediated by a certified contractor. It's presumed to have lead if it was built before 1978. So that's the rule, and that's what code enforcement looks at when dealing with these dangers. So and this can apply to people who are living in housing of last resort because it's an older housing stock, as well as folks who are living in a 1920s home, right? And you just want to remodel and you do it yourselfer and you're pretty good at it, but yet you don't know that there's that risk, right? And that goes into my second point of the challenges, is that there's a lack of child testing. It's not universally, children are not being universally tested, we're finding. It's been compounded recently because of COVID, where, you know, for about two and a half years now, folks haven't been taking their children to their pediatrician visits because of those restrictions, or because things were closed, or they don't want to take public transportation, or the doctors are saying, if you're with a fever, don't come in, right? You know, I have some experience with that myself as a parent. You know, and those are the preventive protocols, right, that are preventing that. But also, even before COVID, there were some testing that was sporadic, and there wasn't a lot of active engagement in medical and pediatricians or community clinics that were asking proactive questions. Do you live in pre-1978 housing stock? Is your paint chipping and peeling? Are you in high risk areas? Those things were not being asked. Has there been remodeling recently in your home? So there was all these assumptions that were being done, or just because, honestly, as an advocate, I will be honest with you, some clinics and healthcare providers just were not doing it because it was just too much of a hassle to seek reimbursement from the government for that testing, and that's part of a whole education program that we have to do as a community in ensuring that our rights are respected, and we are demanding that you know, we are getting at least some baseline testing and making sure that our children are not getting exposed. Now, the other problem that we've worked with in the community is that a lot of the results are not translated. So if I say, you know, your child has a blood lead level of, you know, 10 micrograms per deciliter, you might as well be speaking in a foreign language to most people. They do not know what that means. They do not know the context. Well, is that good, bad? I've seen some clinics give a happy face or a sad face, you know, or a thumbs up or a thumbs down, or good or not good. That does not empower a parent to make an educated decision on, okay, what do I need to do now? What next steps do I need to do to intervene? And while for you know, some county agencies, a level of concern or a threshold might be at a certain level that triggers their action, it doesn't mean that the child is not getting exposure and negative effects, as Katie mentioned earlier, under those thresholds. So we want to make sure we know what that number is. What's your number, and what does that mean? We have that for cholesterol, right? We have that for sugar. So people need to know what their lead level is, their child's lead level is, because that's the only way that a parent can make an educated decision on what they need to do. And of course, as was mentioned earlier, screening is important. Getting those test results, there's nothing better than a lead test to find out specifically what that number is and what does that mean. And I'll talk a little bit about that in my presentation, and getting that screening, because as was mentioned by my colleagues, that exposure and that contamination of lead in a child has ripple effects that are permanent. So the earlier we screen, the earlier we can start stopping the damage and minimizing its negative effect, and providing assistance to that child, because early detection makes a difference in the amount of services and support that a child in our community can get. And it does matter, and I'll share some information as to why the ripple effect throughout their lifetime is negative to a robust community, and you know, and through generations. And next slide, please. So what makes lead dangerous? Next slide. So lead is a developmental neurotoxin, and exposure to or consumption of lead products is harmful and has a a great medical risk. So scientists for many years have warned for the lead use. And I think Katie brought up a great example at the beginning. It's been back in ancient Roman times, right? Where they were using lead and they were seeing the negative effects of lead. So it's been known for many, many years. So next slide. So why would it be in our homes and our environment if lead is so dangerous? That's a great question. Next slide. Well, I'll tell you right now we have restrictions on using lead products, but this wasn't always the case. Lead has been used through for centuries, and through mass production, it changed the scale of lead poisoning because companies were making lead products for profit, and they were ignoring the signs of illnesses and prioritizing gains. That's just the reality, and without any regulation to stop it, lead continued to be added to more and more products because it was cheap, and it was a material that was cheap to use, and it just preserved a lot of the materials, specifically in paint. It resisted weatherization a lot better than regular paint. Next slide, please. So now I want to focus on how community efforts and environmental policies led through those community efforts are working to limit lead in our home and our environment, and have worked to limit that. Next slide, thank you. So I wanted to share a brief history of anti-lead legislation. And as you can see, way back as far as 1971, they did the lead-based Poisoning Prevention Act, and that started the phase out of lead-based paint in 1978, where it was finally outlawed. So any lead-based paint was no longer able to be used unless it was already stocked for it to be sold. Now, the problem with that in homes is that homes that were painted during that time still have that old legacy paint, right? Underneath the newer paint. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And so there was a gradual phase out of other lead-based plumbing was banned in 1985. The lead gasoline was they stopped using it in 1995, where it was outlawed. I remember growing up, and I'll age myself, there was leaded and unleaded paint when I was growing up, right? I was like, well, what does that mean? Nothing. I didn't know the impact it has, but all of that environmental history adds up, because it even though we're not using lead paint anymore, I mean lead gasoline, it just bioaccumulated in the soil and it's still around. And then in 2008, I think Martin referenced the RRP rule, which is the EPA lead-based paint renovation, repair, and painting rule, which are guidelines for safe remodeling, safe rehab, safe paint restoration, and encapsulation and remediation protocols that were implemented now as guides for folks moving forward. Next slide, please. So how much lead was considered toxic? Back in 1970, about 60 micrograms per deciliter was considered toxic, right? And that was established because after a survey of blood lead levels, and a survey of blood lead levels found 78% of persons aged 1 through 74 years and 88% of children aged 1 to 5 had blood lead levels over 10 micrograms with that 60 micrograms per deciliter threshold. So as more and more studies came down, the blood lead levels were lowered. And by the end of the 20th century, we knew that even in small amounts, lead was dangerous. Next slide, please. So now we believe their threshold is way lower. In 2012, CDC replaced the term blood lead level concern with a reference blood lead level value of 5 micrograms per deciliter of blood. That means anyone with a 5 micrograms per deciliter of blood lead level on their test was now going to get some intervention. And in 2021, the CDC lowered that reference level even more, down to 3.5 micrograms per deciliter of blood. And that's the lowest value detectable to many testing systems that use blood as the substance to test for that toxicity of lead. And, this reflects an understanding that there really is no safe level of lead. There isn't. And, as the years you've seen it gone down to the point where now it's 3.5 micrograms per deciliter. But if, as a community advocate, we know that 0 should be the lead level that should be in the environment, but 3.5 is the lowest that it can be tested at this point. And we know that even low level exposures of a 3.5 or a 5 micrograms per deciliter, continuous exposure of that level can be just as bad as a one-time 60 micrograms per deciliter exposure. It can just be as devastating. So we want to make sure that we do a lot of prevention and education in our communities to do that, because all of these levels were lowered due to action and activism from environmental justice advocates and community advocates and community-based organizations pushing for healthier environments and healthier homes. It didn't happen in a vacuum. It didn't. The gasoline companies and the paint companies didn't stop using lead out of their kindness of their hearts. They didn't do it because they had a moral obligation to. They did it because they were forced to, because the law there was pressure put on politicians and legislators to outlaw that toxin, the use of that toxin. And this is very clearly seen that outside of the United States, lead is still used in gasoline, and lead is still used in many things because it hasn't been outlawed in other countries. So, we need to understand the power of our advocacy and the power of our activism to continue moving things forward. Next slide, please. So what are these impacts of elevated blood lead levels? I know some of it was alluded to by Dr. Johnson, and I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into why we are concerned as a community organization on these lead levels and the impacts they have, because we want to make sure everyone has equal access to a good life, the ability to determine who they are going to be and who they want to be, and fulfill their utmost potential. Next slide, please. So the symptoms, I wanted to say that the symptoms of lead poisoning are varied in severity and detectability. So someone might be lead poisoned, but they might not have the clear indicators physically. They might not be showing them, while some others might. And we know that low levels can still affect folks whose brains are still developing. Higher blood lead levels can lead to severe physical conditions and severe illnesses. In extreme cases, it leads to death. But lower levels do lead to developmental reduction of capacities. So we want to make sure that that is addressed. Next slide, please. So for children who are smaller, and you may be asking, well, why focus on children? Well, it's because children are smaller and they're still developing. So anything that poisons that development or affects that development has an exponential negative effect on their growth, and creates developmental delays, even with smaller levels. And as early as 1970s, research identified that children with elevated blood lead levels had lower IQs, less verbal competence, worse speech processing, and worse attention than their peers without lead exposure. Next slide, please. Now, lifetime effects of lead exposure. So as children's blood lead levels increases from 1 to 10 micrograms per deciliter, experts estimate a loss of anywhere between 3.9 to about 7 IQ points. That is a big deal. And the further you go up, you continue to have more IQ loss. And that creates learning disabilities and developmental obstacles, lower educational attainment and achievement, lower reading readiness and entering kindergarten, coupled with behavioral issues such as impulsivity, behavioral difficulties, antisocial behaviors, and some substance abuse disorders. Next slide. So now, what happens when that child is lead poisoned? They now have negative effects on their educational attainment, and they're more likely to be classified as learning disabled in elementary school, have lower out of grade test scores, are 30% more likely to fail third grade reading or math tests, and are less likely to place into advanced programs. Next slide. And one study in 2020 found that over 6,000 students in Cleveland, since they were surveyed in the study of 2007, over 6,000 students, they found that the group with elevated blood lead levels were 31% more likely to be asked to repeat ninth grade, 18% less likely to graduate from high school on time, and 30% less likely to graduate at all. And 18% less likely to attend college. Now, this affects a community at this level where now this individual can no longer improve their economic gains. They can't get better jobs and keep growing and building their personal wealth. And we want to make sure that that doesn't happen from the beginning. Next slide, please. So how can I minimize lead exposure? We'll get into that now. Okay, one, be aware of hazards in your home and the environment. Know the history of lead use and get context for that and clues as to where lead could be on this day. Next slide. The average paint interior used before 1950 contained about 50% lead. So those homes need to be, you need to be more careful with and make sure that the paint is intact or it's some way encapsulated and protected, because if it's chipping and peeling, that's the risk that you're facing with that high concentration of lead in the paint. So lead paint or window panes contains the dust and the soil around the homes that we want to be careful about. Next. Identify lead hazards. Make sure that you watch out for peeling paint, dust, discolored, contaminated water, contaminated soil around chipping or peeling paint. Watch out for construction, renovation, or natural disturbances that can intensify that lead contamination. We've heard no dry scraping, no sanding, right? Especially for homes built before 1978. Next slide. And if you do identify lead paint, then if you want to get rid of it, you should vacuum with HEPA filter and wet mop or wet wipe. Avoid disturbing as best you can, and make sure you take preventive measures and do remediation if it's possible, because that is the best solution to get rid of this household hazard. Next slide. So identify the exposure early. Know the signs of lead poisoning. Test your child and the home if you suspect exposure. Next slide. How do I know that my child has been lead poisoned? Well, you need to consult with the pediatrician to get that lead test done, and you have to demand that a lead test be done. You can't be charged for that blood lead test if your child is under 18, regardless of insurance status. All children in LA care or should be tested automatically at 1 year and 2 years. And don't let anyone assume that you're not in a risk category, because you could be living in a pre-1920s home and you just decided to remodel and you just didn't know the risk, and your child has been lead poisoning. So don't let folks assume that you're not in an at-risk category. Next slide. And I put this slide up here because Frank Lanternman Regional Center is a good place to start. If your child has been lead poisoned, folks should make consultations with them, because they provide wraparound services for a child to get early intervention for folks who are at risk of lead poison or who have been lead poisoned, to minimize the negative effects of that lead poisoning. Next slide. So lead, the home if it has lead hazards, the best way is to contact a licensed inspector or get a license sample from the EPA accredited lab. And I put the lab in here that's closest to us in Los Angeles would be the Long Beach Public Health Lab that does testing for a small fee. You can do a lead check swab, but it's very limited in its effect because it just checks the surface, right? It doesn't check for underlying the old lead-based paint underneath, unless it's cut up like this you see in this picture and chipping and peeling. Next slide. Prevent your children from ingesting or inhaling any unknown substances, chipping paint, peeling paint, or the lead dust. That's the best way to make sure that you can prevent that. Next slide. Okay, limit or remediate lead hazards in your home. That is the best way to do that. Our recommendation is to remediate the lead hazard and make sure that it's that hazard is taken care of. Next slide. So it's crucial that remodels in lead hazardous homes are done with caution by EPA certified personnel. And if you don't see folks remodeling old homes with this type of containment or this type of covering, then you know there's something wrong. They're not only endangering your community's environment, but their own, because they possibly will be taking home some of that lead poisoning dust. Next slide. So if you are remodeling, always use protective equipment. Keep pregnant women and children out of the work site. Try not to disturb that lead paint. Avoid making particles airborne. So no scraping, burning, power washing, sandblasting, anything that allows that dust to go airborne. And always use plastic coverings and protections and wet mop. Next slide. So if the landlord is remodeling, then if you see that they're not doing any protective measures, then you need to contact the Los Angeles Housing Department. If you live in the city of Los Angeles, call their complaint hotline and ask for an emergency stop work order. If you're in LA County areas, then you can contact the number here, the 974-1234 for environmental emergencies. Next slide. Now, I want to talk about specifically lead hazard remediation. We keep talking about lead remediation. Now, we work in conjunction with Los Angeles Housing Department's lead hazard remediation program, which is similar to Lead-Free Homes LA. Next slide. And the purpose of the lead hazard remediation program is to reduce that lead-based paint hazard in the city of LA. And it provides this outreach and education to LA residents on the hazards, prevention, and control. And they work with their inspections unit and the code enforcement unit and handy worker programs. And they provide up to $25,000 per area parcel number for that work done. Next slide. Now, the application process, I believe, would be similar to Lead-Free Homes LA. The owner or a tenant and the tenants complete the applications. They have to show income eligibility. They have to have a child 6 years old or younger that live or frequent that property, get a blood lead test, and provide all the documentation on ownership and participation. And next slide. And here's just an example of what the income guidelines would be for anyone in the city of LA who is in a pre-1978 housing stock. So for a, and then you would go to a lead inspection risk assessment, which is a formal report on certified lead testing contractor, where they do a report on where the hazards were found on the property. Next slide. And then with that, they get a scope of work and they tell the resident and the property owner what they're going to do the remediation on and what the work's going to entail. And if it requires a tenant to temporarily leave their home while they do the work, and it's explained to all parties involved. Next slide. And of course, the workers, they conduct the inspections to ensure, let's say, work practices. They are EPA certified, so they have all the material, all the HEPA machines, do the proper work, and they make sure that all the waste is contained and removed in a safe manner. Next slide. And at the end, this is a benefit to the property owner and as well to the tenants. There's a clearance and lab sampling. So once that test is done and the work is completed, they do clearance testing, make sure there's no lead risk. The lead risk has been reduced or removed or encapsulated. And then folks get a clearance test results. Next slide. So here's some before and after pictures. If you look at the awning and you look at the roof, under the roof, there was a lot of lead paint, chipping, peeling paint that was repaired, removed. Next slide. The window sills also were replaced, or the windows were replaced in this home, and with the new thermal windows. Next slide. Sometimes in older homes, the existing cabinets, the existing kitchen drawers also have lead. So a lot of that is remediated and cleared up, especially if they have built-in cabinets that oftentimes has the lead paint in it. Next slide. And here is a quick promo for the program. I believe if you feel you qualify, you live in the city of LA, pre-1978, have children or visit, or live in the property that are under 6, you want a warm body to talk to, you can contact me and I can help you along with the application process. So that would be the next slide. Okay, and I'm not going to go into frequently asked questions. I'll leave it for the slide deck. I might be able to answer some of those, but I focused a lot on rights as a renter. You can read it at your leisure. Next, I want to be cognizant of my colleagues' times too, and allow folks to check the slide deck later. But if we can continue to the last slide, please. All right, and I do want to acknowledge that this research and presentation was compiled and created by Lucia Giagovan for the Coalition for Economic Survival through a Anderson Fellowship program at Occidental College. So I want to thank her for the content and material that allowed us to do this presentation today. And my colleagues, thank you for having me here at this EJ Summit. And I hope this information was useful, and I'm looking forward to continued discussion. Thank you all.
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you so much. I really love seeing those pictures of the before and after. A couple people were asking about that earlier during Janet's presentation, and it's just really neat to see how the homes are transformed through these remediations. And thank you for sharing all of the information on what you do and that important work, and again emphasizing the importance of community action. Thank you for that. There's a question in the chat, thank you, from Swati Sharma. Is there a site or a website or resource that lists all of the EPA accredited labs for lead testing? Carlos, are you aware of a resource like that?
I'm only aware of the Long Beach one that I put the information in the slide deck. So yeah. So
and if Martin is still on, maybe he has some additional information on, like, how do people know if they get their own lead testing that it's being done by an EPA accredited lab?
Yes, I'm still here. Excellent question. I just responded in the chat really quickly. Great. Yes. So the EPA, US EPA has a nice handy list. National Lead Lab Accreditation Program lists all the accredited labs in the United States to do lead testing on soil, water, and paint, and dust, sorry. Also, the CDPH, I was also checking, does this sites too in California. California has a environmental lab accreditation program, and that also lists labs that are doing lead testing too. But your go-to source would be the National Lead Lab Accreditation Program from the US EPA. I put just their websites, epa.gov, pretty easy. And you just type in National Lead Lab and you'll get the list on there.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And thank you, Carlos, for spending some time talking about the blood lead levels and what that means for families when they get a result back, and kind of, you really hit that head on as far as what does that number mean. So I know I'm going to go back and kind of review some of those slides you presented. It had a lot of information on, so on those slides as far as, what each level means, and just showing the shift in that toxicity level over time, right? To now we understand there's no safe level of lead that's been identified. So let's move along. We have our last presenter on the panel. I'd like to introduce now Chris Parrish, and really excited to get a different perspective on this lead issue than what we're used to hearing about in urban LA. But Chris just has so much experience working on, with communities and partners on non-lead advocacy. So we're hoping this will be an excellent last presenter to kick off our discussion. Chris Parrish is the president and CEO of the Peregrine Fund, founded in 1970 to restore the peregrine falcon, and now one of the leading wildlife conservation organizations working with raptors worldwide. The Peregrine Fund's success in the delisting of the peregrine falcon in 1999 led to the expansion of its raptor conservation efforts on behalf of more than 100 species in 65 countries. Parrish spent 5 years with the Arizona Game and Fish Department to start his career, and for nearly 20 years after that, he led the Peregrine Fund's California Condor Recovery Program in northern Arizona and southern Utah. In 2018, he became the Peregrine Fund's Director of Conservation, managing numerous programs, including co-founding the North American Non-Lead Partnership that now includes more than 40 partners across the United States. The Peregrine Fund's approach to conservation covers the full spectrum, beginning with foundational science to identify problems, captive breeding, release and management of reintroduction populations, and most importantly, educating and mobilizing efforts with citizens to promote healthy ecosystems. So thank you, Chris. That's what we're about here. We want to mobilize our communities to take action. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you all for the opportunity, and I've definitely enjoyed the presentations. What I've observed is that we have so many similarities that you'll be pleasantly surprised of the familiarity, although I don't go into some of the detail. But we've done research on XRF technology for use in assessing lead levels in raptors and raptor blood samples, and the conversations about the potential for exposure for humans. Anyway, don't have enough time to go into all of it, but it'll make sense, and it will be a little bit of a new scope or a new view of the same issue with lead and its potential impacts to wildlife and ecosystems in which we all depend and live within. So with that, I'll start with the next slide. I'm going to go through some summary data that I've plucked from our program to reintroduce the California condor. Of course, being in Southern California, you all are familiar with this species because that's where the stronghold of the species remained as their population was declining, down to just 22 individuals. Today, I'm happy to report there are over 500 individuals in total, including those birds in captivity and those birds that are in the wild, both in Arizona and Utah, because of some of our efforts with our partners, and of course, the 3 populations in California, spanning from the South Central San Joaquin Valley, which is also where I grew up, outside of Bakersfield, all the way up through the Central Valley of Pinnacles National Monument, which is now a national park, and up into the Big Sur area, where Ventana Wilderness Society mortality runs the release side up there. So when you look at these data, you look at the causes of mortality, and we're really interested in that with endangered species because we want to ascertain why these species are declining. Is it something we have to do with, or something we can do something about, or is it a natural process whereby these species are declining because, for the example of the condor, they've been around since the Pleistocene. So they were here prior to the end of the last ice age. So it's interesting to note that. We monitor these birds that we release. And of course, in addition to the birds we release, we now have birds that are producing their own young in the wild, and we monitor them as well. The primary cause for monitoring them is to determine their causes of death so that we can answer that age-old question of why were they declining. You see here that we have diagnosed and undiagnosed causes of death. And of course, undiagnosed, some are unknown, some just go missing, and some it's not conclusive, but you know, in the necropsies, which is an autopsy for wildlife, it'll just say highly indicative of lead, but not confirmed. So when you look at the diagnosed causes of mortality, this really paints the picture. 53% of those birds that we recover that have died were confirmed by necropsy to have died of lead poisoning. Of the other causes of death, predation, which is something natural in the animal world, there are only 21. So less than half of all of those that died of lead have died from predation. The good news there is that the number one cause of mortality is identified, and it's preventable. So again, common language there. You can see there are other causes of mortality. And of course, there's some like, you know, some birds are still shot, some mistakenly and some intentionally. So, but the main story is that we can solve that number one cause of mortality, and looking at population demographics and the modeling that we can do to put those birds lost to lead back into the wild and calculate the number of young they would have produced in their lifetime, we would be much closer to recovery, and it'd be a tremendous success story for conservation. And most importantly, as you'll see here in a minute, a success story for what hunters can do for conservation of an endangered species. Next slide.
Chris, I'm sorry to interrupt, but could you speak a tad bit slower for the interpreters?
You bet. I'm going to have to cut down on a lot of info. My apologies. I knew this would be a problem because I talk so fast and try to pack too much in. Next slide, please. Some of the types of data that we use are very similar to those that are used in humans. And that's because most of these techniques have been derived in working with humans. And humans are a great case for study because they can answer questions. Wildlife, however, cannot. So we answer a lot of those questions by making inferences on the data we collect. When we found the first birds that died from lead poisoning that we had released, we began studying every time we grabbed a bird or trapped a bird from the wild, we took a blood sample. When we plot these lead levels, you can see here that the peak of exposure and the severity, the peak of severity of exposure, coincided with the months of November and December for this 5-year period that we did this analysis. And this was, of course, published in the paper you see there cited below. The unique thing about this is that it also coincided with a deer hunting season, which is a major thing in some communities where people go out in mass in the forest and hunt deer. And then because the Peregrine Fund is founded by hunters, and many of us are lifelong hunters and anglers, we saw this similarity or this coincidence in November and December and thought, man, it must be somehow related to lead. But in sticking to our core science, we did studies. Next slide. The first study was to quantify the different types of lead we were able to identify, because lead in blood, there are a lot of problems there because the half-life of lead in blood in condors and other birds of prey is only about 15 days. So you can miss an exposure event that might be represented or otherwise indicated by a sample of bone lead or tissue lead, specifically organ lead. But as you get up into bone and brain lead, as you all well know, the half-life is much, much longer. But we had evidence in these x-rays where we had found of dead birds, where we had found intact bullets in 3 cases, fragments like you see here in this picture in 17 cases, and some bird shot. So the small pellets that are contained within shotgun shells, all of these types of lead were identified in the digestive system of these birds. So they had consumed something that had that type of lead in it. Next slide. The first major study that put this on the map for wildlife, really, in our world of raptor ecology, we quantified rates of fragmentation in natural hunting circumstances where high-powered rifles are used to hunt animals like deer. So we took a sample of 34 deer in the first study, and we x-rayed the animals whole after they had been shot under normal hunting circumstances. So 100 to 200 yards with high-powered centerfire rifle ammunition, most of it lead-based. 100% of the deer that we shot, of course, contained lead because it's a lead-based bullet. 90% of the gut piles had fragments, and some of them had more than 200 fragments. The only 2 deer that didn't have fragments in the gut pile, and for those of you who don't hunt, let me explain what that is, because people will recite what I'm saying here, and most hunters, if talking to a non-hunter, will say, well, we don't shoot them in the guts. Okay. So why is it called a gut pile? It's basically all of the animal that we leave in the field when we harvest the meat. So quite commonly, the animal will be shot in the vitals, and then the vital organs all the way down and through the intestines and stomach will be left in the field. Now, this is a great food source for scavenging wildlife because scavengers follow humans who are hunters, whether it was 10,000 years ago or today, because there's a good food source. The only 2 gut piles that didn't have fragments were animals that weren't targeted or weren't shot in the vital organs, and they were headshots. But we wanted to see to what extent these fragments existed, and therefore help explain why a scavenger like a condor, which is an obligate scavenger, they only feed on things that are already dead. So they're more vulnerable or have a higher probability of coming across lead during hunting season. Next slide. This is the most important part of what we did next. A lot of conservation science is science in the realm of conservation, but in order to make the products of our scientific papers and turn them into conservation, we have to do something with that information. And the most important thing we need to do is translate it to the lay public in a way that it makes sense. And this is really my passion for conservation because, again, I came from a lower income family in Southern San Joaquin Valley. Because we had the condor there as well, what I found as I began studying conservation biology in school is that we didn't have a problem that the local community members couldn't understand the issues, is that we had a failure to communicate. So this most important step was what we did with our science in 2003. We took the information to the Arizona Game and Fish Department because they manage hunting. And we wanted to contact the hunters because in this case, with a point source of lead that is affecting a species at a population limiting level, we wanted to deal directly with the hunters. Arizona Game and Fish obliged, and we shared the results of our studies and urged hunters to participate in a voluntary incentive-based outreach and education program that both provided the education, but really provided an incentive to overcome the barriers that stand in changing human habits, which are sometimes cost, availability, lack of familiarity. And we solved all those problems, or began solving it early on with sharing this information. And what we found is that very soon after, in both Arizona and southern Utah, where condors were flying around, when we shared the information in this manner, we achieved within 3 years 80% voluntary participation. Now that was phenomenal because it was working, but it's on a small scale because it's only two-week seasons per year. And of course, condors are out there feeding on all types of things, including things that are shot year round. And it's not just deer. But we followed the science and we took the information from our study in deer hunting situations and shared that and developed our program small and began there. Now, with the North American Non-Lead Partnership, we're expanding to a landscape scale to share this information of the condor and what implications there are for ecosystem health with other scavenging wildlife, including predators, including humans, of how we might avoid this preventable source of lead poisoning. Next slide. You may also know, and I think you have to click through until all of the text shows up here. You may also have heard about there's a ban on lead ammunition in California. There was a small scale ban in 2007 and 8 in California in the range of the condor, and it has since expanded to a full ban for all types of hunting in July of 2019. Now, that may cause for joy in some of our minds because of the logic that if it's banned, then the problem goes away. But I bet you all know that despite regulations, people change when their hearts and minds change, not just when laws change. So regardless of our efforts to do voluntary incentive-based education, so a voluntary mitigative response, and regardless of the ban in California, 50% of diagnosed deaths in condors in the entirety of the range still remain lead caused. So we still have a lot of work to do, even though we've defined pretty clearly the source. Next slide. That's what led us to go back and think about how it is we use science and we do conservation. There are tons of stories about conservation and our early, founders in conservation that we always talk about, whether it's Teddy Roosevelt or Aldo Leopold pictured here, or the conservation success stories of species like the bald eagle or the peregrine falcon, who were affected not only by lead, but other major contaminants like DDT. Some of the results of the eggshell thinning that happens in bird species that cause them to not be able to repopulate and reproduce successfully have been overcome. Then you begin thinking about behavior change. How do you change behavior? Because it's not just knowing better that changes behavior. You have early innovators, early adopters, you have the early majority, late majority, and then you have laggards, and then you have some people that you'll never change their behavior, no matter if it's a law or not. So we went back to the drawing board, and next slide. And we also experienced the backfire effect, something that when you take information that, hey, it's science, therefore it's the best gospel we have right now, and you share it with hunters and you see the response of, oh, this is an anti-hunting campaign, or this is attacking my rights to keep and bear arms. Oh my goodness, there are many landmines that we've experienced in talking about this issue over the last 20 some years. But we decided, next slide, we decided that the best thing we could do is take back one up. The best thing we could do is take our practice and our philosophy and foundation and take it to a broader scale and put it into partnership. So this non-lead partnership was founded by the Peregrine Fund, the Institute for Wildlife Studies, and the Oregon Zoo. And Institute for Wildlife Studies is a company that works a lot in California, and they do some of the work with eagles out in the islands in Catalina. Anyway, these are the three founders, and I'll tell you the story about the logo here soon because there's content there as well. So we set about, next slide, we set about a, I think, well, to sum it all up, we made presentations in all these states, and this is not a complete map. And we did most of this within the first year and a half. I put on 115,000 miles on a pickup in 15 months. And we also, at the invitation of many state wildlife agencies, made presentations on the subject matter with them and their constituents in those states that you see there. We've since signed on more partners that you can find on nonleadpartnership.org. We're targeting wildlife management agencies and hunter groups, and not the broader conservation community yet, because we want to change the behavior of hunters. So we're focusing on where they get their information. And that's through the wildlife management agencies, and thought leaders like hunting groups, and landowners play a big role there too, because a lot of large tract landowners allow hunting on their properties, just like Tejon Ranch in California. And Tejon Ranch, oddly enough, was one of the first ones to go lead-free in 2007. We also have 4 state partners: Arizona Game and Fish, Utah Division of Wildlife Resources, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and Washington State. So those partners actually have programs where they're engaging their hunters and sharing this information. And remember, it's not a story about an endangered species, although that's where I happen to learn most of my information there from 22 years with them. It's a story about how we learned about a preventable problem that benefits ecosystem health. Next one. All right, I know I'm going to be running out of time. The levels of partnership I won't focus on. You can go to the website to see those. But there is one key concept here: is the least level of commitment is just a group who says, we support the way you're doing business. We will allow you to use our logo and our name on your website because we appreciate that you're not going straight to a ban, you're trying to change behavior. So in support of means they simply just support what we're doing, all the way up and through a full partner. Next slide. And I think the next slide just shows you a smattering of all those different groups. And what you'll notice there, which is not a surprise because I already told you that we're focusing on the hunter groups, is we really are putting a lot of effort into those hunter groups, going out to the communities, just as you would a small community by approaching, say, a Lions Club or a Chamber of Commerce. We're going to those areas first, and then landowners. And you can see all of our partners here. We now have over 46 partners. We're adding more, it seems, weekly sometimes, but only a few of them are listed here for you to see. But the website has it all. More about the way we're going about this, next slide, is we're showing the people that we too are hunters, and my family hunts. We pride ourselves on either growing or harvesting any of the meat that we eat, in addition to everything else we harvest in the woods. So we're asking them to hear about our experiences, consider their own, and do good things for wildlife. And when we do it that way, we're very happy and satisfied with the results. We just need to figure out how to do it on a landscape scale, beyond the deer hunters in northern Arizona to the hunters across the nation, and for that matter, now globally. Next slide. Another popular place where people get their information is from websites and forums and podcasts. Next slide. So we're seeing more and more response and an evolution of the acceptance of this notion that we can act on behalf of wildlife without being required to do so. And we're really encouraged by that. Go ahead and flip through the next few. Mule Deer Foundation is another one. We do podcasts. We do programs, next slide, on the Zumwalt Prairie. And again, these are private landowners, in this case, the Nature Conservancy, where they do education outreach programs that are specifically targeted to their hunters. Next slide. I already mentioned the website, but you can take a look at that. I would also encourage you, if you're interested in this hunting side of the lead story, to visit our co-founders webpage at huntingwithnonlead.org. And that's a wonderful site for those of you who are hunters, or those of you who want to engage with hunters. That's a wonderful resource as well. And they're, like I said, they're a co-founder. And last slide is the logo. And I just wanted to point out that the back, the gold part or the copper part there is the back of a bullet. And then you see non-lead. And at the center of a bullet, which is what makes the gunpowder in a cartridge ignite, which sets off the explosion that pushes the bullet down range. That's called the primer. And so that's what starts it all. And at the primer of our logo, right in the center, is the generation that came before us and the generation that follows. And one of the major messages that we have for our fellow hunters and conservation-minded people who aren't hunters is that the way in which we proceed has more to do with our success than our science. And when people question that, I say, well, who's guiding culture? Is it scientists and peer-reviewed publications? I don't think people are reading a lot of those. We have to translate them and we have to be active. And so for our story, we have to be true conservationists by using solid science and sharing it in a manner that allows us to communicate. And then, of course, it's all linked into partnership. From those species we have hunted traditionally for as long as humans have been known to hunt in North America, all the way to the era of conservation we're in today, where we have organizations like ours, the Peregrine Fund, that works globally to study and save birds of prey. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was really great perspective to hear all your efforts and your success building a coalition around a common cause. And yeah, it sounds like you face a lot of the similar enforcement and communication challenges that we experience here in LA County around lead. So thanks for that. So we have about 20 minutes left for discussion and questions, and like to hear some back and forth among our panelists and the audience. And so I have a question to start us off, focused on that one key theme of a few themes that came up through these presentations on the importance of prevention, lead prevention. Dr. Johnson, you hit on that pretty hard, and the importance of lead prevention. So that first question I have for the panelists is, and feel free to chime in as you feel comfortable, what opportunities do you see to expand our education and outreach on lead prevention?
I'll start, I suppose. So I think increasingly we've seen soil in urban areas as this huge sort of reservoir of toxic lead. And I think there's been not as much attention put on soil compared to paint and some of these other indoor sources. So I think, expanding opportunities to get your soil tested for lead, as well as to think about ways that people can get mulch or sandboxes or other things to address reducing exposure that comes from soil lead contamination, and ultimately really thinking about more systematic approaches to making sure we get a lot of this soil lead contamination cleaned up.
Thanks, Jill. Yeah, because we heard, about the extensive remediation programs that exist, and they're really comprehensive, addressing the paint and the soil and everything, but that takes a lot of resources and time. So you're pointing out, okay, there's some easy things that maybe are less resource intensive, but could make a big difference to prevent contact with contaminated soil. So thank you. That's a great point. Any other thoughts from the panelists on lead prevention, and how can we expand our prevention efforts?
Yeah, I think it's a couple of points to touch on that. One is at the community level, we need a lot more engagement with parents and the community in general. A lot more information on what the risks are, how likely we are to be exposed to lead, and some areas are more exposed to lead or have been exposed to lead than others, but it doesn't mean the other communities who are not, let's say an example, in an X side don't have that danger. Because I often see, I hear about the X side story, but they may be living in a pre-1978 home, right? Mm-hmm. So they don't make that connection. They think, this is just one exposure because this was a bad actor over there, but they don't connect to, this can affect me also because I live in a 1920s bungalow, right? And I have small children, and the paint is chipping and peeling because I'm in rent control, and the landlord doesn't maintain the property in good condition, so it's all chipping, peeling, and my kids like poking at it and scraping it, right? Or it's got that friction surface with the old double hung windows that cause that dust. So the education, continuous education, right? Because as we know, there's LA is a a city that is always in transition, right? So we always have new folks coming in, and folks moving out, and that's that's the cycle. So it's a continuous education effort at the community level, but then also in the care sector for our local pediatricians and our local community clinics to more actively test children and make it that all children are tested to try to capture, especially right now moving out and post-COVID, or not really post-COVID, but moving out and things are opening up a little bit more. People are feeling a little more comfortable going out to the doctor's visit. Make sure that these kids who haven't gotten that test in the past 2-3 years do get that test, because if it is in the home, you will see it, and that lead contamination does stay in the body for at least 30 days. And then on a system level, making sure that our local code enforcement is empowered and has that mandate to check for those risks, right? Chipping, peeling paint. Make sure that code enforcement is able to do that, and there's some sort of mechanism and penalties for not maintaining those properties in good condition, right? Because the code says the paint has to be an intact surface because of that presumed risk. So at the very minimum, we want them to minimize the risk and contain that lead exposure, and then of course have people be more aware of lead abatement programs like Healthy Homes LA and the City of LA's lead hazard remediation program that is there for communities that are mostly impacted by this lead risk, to have access to it and make it easier for folks to participate and have their homes remediated and make a healthier home for not just them, but little by little the community's health gets improved, right?
Thank you, Carlos. And yeah, thanks for touching on our next question, which is opportunities to strengthen enforcement. It came up in several of the presentations, and Chris, I think you drove that point home well, is, we can have bans on lead in consumer products and in paint and in ammunition and all of these sources, but we still see it popping up, and doesn't mean that it's not in our environment and not being used. So how can we strengthen enforcement? Are there specific opportunities for agencies to do more enforcement? Are there any thoughts on how to lift up some enforcement ideas? I know that's a tough one.
Well, yeah, since we deal with this quite a bit, I mean, you think about enforcement capacity, and oftentimes when I can't come up with an answer, I revisit the question. And really the question is, what changes behavior? Enforcement is one. And I think you have to, if you want a ban, for example, or a piece of legislation to really change behavior, you have to lay the groundwork. Because in this day and age, agencies, governments, heck, even large corporations, right? There's a distrust out there of anything that seems institutionalized. So I think you have to build that trust and regain that trust. And that means rebuilding the system by which we govern ourselves. And that's why we chose the partnership route. Yes, it's slow, but we're building a foundation to operate from, that hopefully will lend to any mitigative approach to work. So yeah, that's not answering your question directly, but in law enforcement with wildlife management, there's one officer per region, and some states only have 30 regions or 40 regions for the whole state. It's not going to be enforced. It has to be self-enforced. And then that begs the question, what's the best route? Is the best route by making it a law that results in self-enforcement, or is it because they want to do good things for themselves and their families and their communities, including their environment?
Right. I agree with Chris in that you do need collaboration, and we're talking about some government agencies learning to collaborate with community-based organizations, and it does take some time, right, to build that relationship. But the understanding is you have to partner up with organizations that are close to the community you're trying to serve, because you're not going to get that trust, because you're a government agency doesn't mean anything to the community anymore. It's actually more suspect, right? In some senses. So creating those relationships and having it be a level, not a subservient relationship, but a partner relationship is key to making sure we have those changes. Because then we as advocates, when we're dealing with our government allies, we can identify gaps in policy that they can't lobby for. We can. Right. So those are the things that we can help identify in the partnership. Like, for example, let's say EPA. EPA only has I think it's 1.3 or 1.4 personnel for our region, which I think is like 6 or 9 states. So that one person cannot monitor all those states, right? So what we've been working with our allies is trying to find a way to transfer some of that responsibility over to local enforcement, and that way local enforcement has an ability to put in penalties that'll stay with the local agencies to keep those enforcement programs going. So the collaboration ends up finding some creative policy fixes, or maybe it's not even a policy fix, it's more of an internal procedures fix. But it's going to take all of us working together to make sure that these things happen. And it's going to be some sort of incentive, but there's also going to be some sort of, stick to it, right? Stick to the carrot.
Yeah, I really appreciate the point about behavior change being so important, and that has to go hand in hand with the enforcement, right? Because our rules and laws aren't going to be followed if people don't believe in them, right? And so that's a great point. And it makes me think, how do we make, back to what Jill said about testing soil, how do we make testing soil more routine, maybe as part of a real estate transaction? Or how do we make blood lead testing more routine and commonplace as part of wellness checkups? So it's all really good food for thought. William, you've been so patient with your hand up. Thank you so much. I know you have a question. Please share.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Mainly I have numerous questions, but the questioning on the last person who was talking about mostly the falcons being poisoned by the lead pellets. So my question is, are states outlawing lead in the bullet and in the slug, in the pellets type bullets, and which I think is not outlawed, and that's why he's going, I assume, to self people, I don't know what you call it, self-motivated change. And then does the slug or the pellets make it out of, do you make them out of something else, iron or some other iron or aluminum? And do they react the same? Do they fly at the same speed and the same? That's my question about the bullets, I guess. The replacements. Yeah.
Yeah, great question, William. And just to be clear, falcons are less affected because they're more of a predator than they are a scavenger. But condors, the California condor and vultures, those obligate scavengers are the ones that are most vulnerable. But by the way, we've had 900 micrograms per deciliter in a blood lead value. It's phenomenal. Wow. Anyway, so to answer your question, yes, some state, California is the only state that has outlawed it, and that began in 2019. Unfortunately, it hasn't had the intended effect of solving the problem for that sentinel species like the condor. And the second question is, most non-lead ammunition is made of copper, when it's a center fire rifle type bullet that you would use for big game. And when it goes down to lead shot, some of those replacements are steel or bismuth or tungsten. And with lead, it's all about the frangibility of the bullet. So high-powered rifle bullets travel so fast, and lead is so malleable that it doesn't hold together, and it strips away and makes fragments. So the number of fragments and the toxicity of lead is kind of a double whammy, if you will. Whereas a solid copper bullet tends to open up and mushroom on the front end, giving the desirable effect that you want for a lethal bullet, but it doesn't fragment, and it's less easily assimilated into the system. You know, if a copper bullet fragmented as bad as a lead bullet, I imagine we might see some copper toxicity issues, but lead is so much more easily assimilated into the system. So I could go on for a lot longer, but I know there are more questions.
Could I ask a follow-up question? Okay, so one of our problems with rifles is now, especially assault rifles, is what is being used in assault rifles that travel faster, and we're having a problem with people being killed with these rifles. So because they travel so fast, are they allowed to use lead in assault rifles? And the military also, are they allowed to use lead bullets?
So many different things to unpack there, but what has been labeled as assault rifles, it's either a center fire rifle ammunition round or it's not. So center fire rifles can be in any configuration in a gun. So there's nothing specific to an assault rifle that makes it different from any other rifle bullet. Gosh, the other there's so many things there.
And we do need to wrap up in just a few minutes. So
let me just finish with this. The majority of ammunition is sold, and you hit on this, is sold in federal contracts to the government. The second leading use and highest quantity of ammunition used is for recreational shooting. The least used thing or the least source of use for ammunition is hunting. So it's a very small percentage of all the ammunition that is used. Most of it is for federal contract, for war, and then the second leading cause is recreational shooting. So there are different tools for different applications. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Chris. And yeah, thank you, William, for the good questions. So thank you everyone for joining today. I don't have any other questions for the panelists, but I will allow the panelists just one last opportunity to chime in on any closing thoughts, and then turn it over to Robina for our wrap up. So
I guess I'll warm up the dance floor here, or the last song. I just want to say, thank you for having us here today, and I hope this information was useful. But please remain active. As an activist, we can't sit back and say, well, we've done it. No, because we have to be continuous, and we have to be always vigilant, because there's always the flip side, right? Trying to undermine and undercut our gains. So we have to try to make things stronger and better, and fight for a better environment for all of us, because the alternative is not having a future, or children or youth not having a future, our communities not having a future, because it's been arrested by some poisoning that could have been prevented. And there's a lot of great resources right now available for folks to do a lot of that prevention and get that education. We'll continue to working on that at the community level, and I invite everyone who is able to stay in the fight, join with organizations like ourselves and our partners here at the EJ Summit that are participating today, to work to move things forward. So thank you all.
Thanks, Carlos. Well, if Jill or Chris, if you don't have any pressing closing comments, I'll turn it over to Robina so she can wrap us up.
Just my thanks. Thank you for the opportunity.
Oh, thank you. So on behalf of the Los Angeles Environmental Justice Network, thank you Thank you to all the attendees, to our technical director from the California Air Resources Board, Helena Rim, for Stephanie Lewis from DTSC for overseeing our chat, for our sponsors, Community Environmental Services, California Air Resources Board, Earth Justice, Los Angeles City Attorney, the California Environmental Protection Agency, Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors, Sheila Kuehl, Janice Hahn, Holly Mitchell, and Hilda Solis, the South Coast Air Quality Management District, and Cal Recycle. And of course, once again, thank you to our moderator, Katie Butler, and all of the speakers, Dr. Jill Johnson, Carlos Aguilar, Janet Scully, Chris Parrish, and Martin Groen, and special thanks to our translators, Mark and Aldo. And of course, to the co-coordinator of the LAEJ network, Cynthia Babich, who I could not do this without. So please, everyone, mark your calendars and join us on our next workshop. The topic is land use, communities' role in planning. It will be Wednesday, September 21st, 10 a.m., 2 p.m. And so stay tuned for a registration link in your email. And thank you all very much for being here today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Have a good day.